My name is Riley Alexander. I am 28. Yesterday afternoon, I sat in a freezing Honolulu law office and watched my father and older brother inherit a luxury resort empire. I sat at the far end of a long mahogany table, holding a plain white envelope containing exactly $60. 3 crisp, vintage $20 bills. My brother Chase laughed so hard he had to wipe his eyes. His platinum watch clinked against the wood. My father Richard just offered me a slow, tight smile. The kind of smile a teacher gives a slow student. The estate attorney kept his eyes fixed on his legal pad, refusing to look at me. Everyone in that room thought the story was over. They thought my grandfather Harrison Thorne, the man who built 7 coastal resorts from nothing, had finally confirmed what they believed my whole life, that I was a disappointment. A girl who works at a marine rescue center instead of climbing the corporate ladder. But they did not know what was hidden on those 3 bills. Before I tell you how those $60 unraveled their entire lives, welcome to Revenge Order. If you enjoy stories where the underdog strikes back, take a second to subscribe. Drop your age and where you are listening from in the comments. I read every single one. Now let me take you back to that conference room. The air conditioning hummed. Lauren, my sister-in-law, sat next to Chase, tapping her manicured nails on her phone screen. She was already browsing real estate listings in Beverly Hills. The attorney cleared his throat and read the final line of the distributions. Richard inherited $40 million in liquid capital and full operational control of the resorts. Chase received $20 million to cover his failing venture capital debts. And to my granddaughter Riley, I leave the sum of $60 in silver certificates. Chase snorted and said, $60? He shook his head, telling me I could maybe buy a nice plastic bucket for those sea turtles I was always crying over. My father smoothed his linen jacket and leaned forward. He told me to try to understand. Harrison built this legacy with sweat and grit. He always said you were a sweet girl, Riley, but you lack the stomach for real capital. He wanted to protect you from burdens you cannot carry. I stared down at the 3 bills. My chest burned. For 36 months, while my father played golf on Maui and my brother burned through bridge loans, I drove to my grandfather's estate every single night. I managed his hospice care. I crushed his medication into applesauce. I held his hand when his breathing turned shallow. They did not visit. They did not call. They only showed up when the heart monitor flatlined. And now they were walking away with the empire while I held bus fare. I did not argue. I did not shed a tear. I simply picked up the currency. But as my thumb traced the face of the top bill, the paper felt unusually stiff. I tilted it toward the overhead fluorescent light. There, near the corner of the serial number, sat a sequence of microscopic red circles, deliberate, precise marks connecting specific digits. Harrison never did anything by accident. I slipped the cash into my pocket. The humiliation was supposed to be the end of it, but my family was not finished. An hour later, I drove my beat-up Jeep down the coastal highway to the small family-owned guest house in Kailua, where I had lived for 5 years. When I pulled into the driveway, my stomach dropped. 4 large cardboard boxes sat on the front lawn. My clothes, my books, my dive gear tossed carelessly into the grass. Chase stood on the porch, flanked by 2 private security guards. He wore designer sunglasses and held a fresh set of brass keys. "We are listing the property tomorrow morning," he said, his voice carrying over the sound of the crashing waves. "Dad wants it liquidated by Friday. You have 10 minutes to get the rest of your fish-hugging gear off the property." I stepped out of the Jeep. The hot Hawaiian sun beat down on my shoulders. "You did not even give me a day's notice," I said. "We do not have to," Chase sneered. "You do not own anything, Riley. You never did. Now hand over the $60. I froze. My brother, who just inherited $20 million, was standing on a porch demanding my pocket change. I asked him why he wanted it, keeping my voice steady. He waved a hand dismissively, saying it was a sentimental joke. He wanted to frame the bills for his office as a reminder of Grandpa's eccentric humor. "Just hand them over and get off my grass," he demanded. Chase was a terrible liar. A vein pulsed near his temple. His sudden desperation was a glaring warning sign. He suspected Harrison left a clue. I looked at my brother, then down at my boxes in the dirt. I told him I already spent it on gas. Chase stepped off the porch, his face flushing dark red. He kicked one of my moving boxes, spilling my sweaters onto the driveway. "You are going to be on the streets by Monday," he warned. I did not engage. I loaded my boxes into the back of my Jeep without a word. As I drove away, leaving the only home I had known, I realized the truth. My family was cutting every tie. But they were terrified of what I held in my pocket. Tonight I would sleep in my car. Tomorrow I would find out where the numbers led. The tires of my old Jeep Wrangler crunched against the gravel shoulder of the Kamehameha Highway. I pulled over just as the Hawaiian sun began its descent, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and burnt orange. I turned off the ignition and gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. My breathing was shallow and uneven. The reality of the last 3 hours was finally settling into my bones. My family had not just disinherited me, they had erased me. I closed my eyes and the scene at the guest house replayed in vivid detail. When I had pulled into the driveway of that modest Kailua property, the place I called home for half a decade, the betrayal hit me like a physical blow. The locks were already swapped. The heavy brass deadbolt I used to turn every night after a long shift at the rescue center was replaced with a shiny silver keypad. And scattered across the front lawn like trash thrown from a moving window was my entire life. 4 flimsy cardboard boxes lay in the damp grass. One had torn open, spilling my marine biology textbooks, the ones I paid for myself by working double shifts waiting tables. Beside them lay my neoprene wetsuits, a battered coffee maker, and a framed photograph of my grandfather and me from a fishing trip 10 years ago. The glass covering the photo was cracked. Standing on the porch above the wreckage was Chase. He was not alone. 2 men with thick necks and tactical polo shirts flanked him, private security hired with thorn money. Chase stood there with his hands in the pockets of his tailored trousers, projecting a casual arrogance. But his eyes gave him away. They darted around, scanning the driveway, scanning me. He told me I was trespassing. He said the property was moving into an LLC tomorrow morning to be liquidated. When I reminded him that Hawaii law required 30 days written notice for any eviction, he just smirked. He told me laws are for people who can afford lawyers. He said if I tried to call the police, his attorneys would bury me in injunctions until I was bankrupt. It was a cold, calculated tactic designed to induce panic. But he did not care about the real estate. Not really. The Kailua guest house was a drop in the ocean compared to the $20 million he had just inherited. The true motive surfaced when he walked down the porch steps, stopping inches from my face. The scent of his expensive cologne mixed with the stale sweat of anxiety. He dropped his voice to a low, urgent whisper. He demanded the $60. He claimed a vintage currency collector was willing to pay a premium for those specific silver certificates. He said he needed the extra cash to offset a few minor crypto losses from last quarter. It was a pathetic lie. Chase never cared about vintage currency. He cared about status. And his venture capital firm was an open secret in the Honolulu financial district. He had blown through millions backing tech startups that vanished into thin air. My father had constantly bailed him out, signing bridge loans to cover Chase's tracks. Chase was drowning in debt, and he thought our grandfather had left a treasure map on those bills. He wanted to snatch whatever final gift Harrison Thorne had intended for me. When I told him I had already spent the cash at a gas station down the road, his reaction told me everything I needed to know. His jaw clenched. A muscle ticked near his right eye. He kicked my box of textbooks, sending a heavy hardcover skidding across the driveway. He told me I was going to be sleeping on the streets. He threatened to make sure I never found a lease on the island again. He was trying to break my spirit, to force me to beg. I did not beg. I knelt in the dirt, gathered my books, and shoved everything into the back of my Jeep. The security guards watched with blank expressions. Chase stood with his arms crossed, a portrait of unearned privilege. I did not look back as I reversed out of the driveway. Now, sitting on the side of the highway with the ocean breeze rushing through the open windows, the adrenaline began to fade. The night air grew cold. I pulled my vehicle back onto the road and drove until I reached a public beach parking lot near Waimanalo. It was quiet here. The only sound was the rhythmic crashing of the surf against the dark sand. I climbed into the back seat, pushing aside a box of kitchen supplies to make room. I unrolled a sleeping bag and wrapped it around my shoulders. The physical reality of my poverty was a bitter pill to swallow. Less than 10 miles away, my father and brother were likely sitting on the lanai of the Thorne corporate penthouse, toasting their new fortune with imported champagne. They had the resort operations. They had the liquid capital. They had the power. And I was shivering in a beach parking lot with a cracked picture frame and a few boxes of clothes. The psychological warfare was designed to make me feel small. For my entire life, Richard and Chase operated on the assumption that I was weak because I chose a different path. I spent my days coordinating rescues for stranded marine life, navigating complex ocean currents, and writing grant proposals for conservation efforts. They viewed my career as a cute hobby. They measured worth in profit margins and stock portfolios. Because my bank account was small, they assumed my intellect was too. They believed throwing me out into the cold would force me into submission, but they underestimated the resilience built from years of self-reliance. I never asked my father for a dime. When my transmission failed, I learned how to rebuild it. When I needed tuition, I earned scholarships. I did not fear the struggle. I feared becoming like them. I reached into the front pocket of my khakis and pulled out the plain white envelope. I smoothed the crinkled paper and extracted the 3 $20 bills. The faces of Andrew Jackson stared back at me, printed in faded green ink. I reached up and clicked on the dim overhead dome light of the Jeep. The yellowish glow illuminated the cramped space. I held the top bill closer to the bulb, squinting. Earlier in the law office, I thought I saw something. Now, in the quiet isolation of the night, I could examine it without my brother's prying eyes. I traced my index finger along the serial number. The ink was slightly raised. Just above the numbers near the upper left border, I found them again. Microscopic circles drawn in a vibrant crimson. They were so small they looked like printing errors or stray dust specks, but they were too uniform. I pulled a small magnifying loupe from my work duffel bag. We used it to examine coral samples at the center. I pressed the glass over the currency. The red marks jumped into sharp focus. Someone had used a needlepoint pen to circle specific digits across all 3 bills. I grabbed a notepad from the dashboard and a pencil. I wrote down every circled number in sequence, moving from the first bill to the second, then the third. 7, 0, 4, 1, 2. The numbers continued forming a long string. It was not random. It was formatted exactly like a financial routing code, followed by a specific internal identifier. My breath caught in my throat. The cold night air seemed to vanish. Harrison Thorne was a man of infinite precision. He built his empire by noticing details his competitors overlooked. He loved codes. When I was a child, he would hide my birthday presents and leave cryptic numerical riddles around the estate for me to solve. He used to say the world gives its best secrets to those who bother to look closely. He knew his son and his grandson would toss a mere $60 aside. He knew they would scoff at the amount and ignore the physical paper. But he knew I would look. He knew I would hold on to the last thing he gave me. This was not an insult. It was a key. I stared at the long sequence of numbers on my notepad. It corresponded to an institution, a highly secured location somewhere on the island. My mind raced through the possibilities. Harrison had accounts at major commercial banks, but those were handled by the estate attorneys. If this was part of the probate, Mr. Davis would have processed it. This was separate. This was hidden. I folded the bills carefully and placed them back into the envelope, tucking it deep inside my jacket pocket. The exhaustion that had weighed me down an hour ago evaporated. A new, sharp energy took its place. Chase was desperate to get his hands on this cash because he suspected Harrison had a contingency plan. Chase was drowning in venture capital debt, and a few million from the estate would barely keep his creditors at bay. He needed a lifeline. He thought he could bully me into handing it over. He was wrong. I looked out the window at the dark horizon where the ocean met the sky. Tomorrow morning, I would not be searching for a new apartment. I would not be calling a lawyer to fight an illegal eviction. I would drive directly into the heart of the Honolulu Financial District. I would take this sequence to the only place my grandfather trusted with his most guarded secrets. My family wanted a war. They started it by locking me out in the dark, but they had no idea what kind of ammunition Harrison Thorne had just placed in my hands. The damp ocean breeze crept through the slight crack in the Jeep window, bringing with it the sharp scent of brine and decaying kelp. I pulled the sleeping bag tighter around my shoulders, shivering against the vinyl seat. The adrenaline that fueled my escape from the Kailua house was burning off, leaving behind a hollow, bone-deep exhaustion. Staring up at the felt roof of the vehicle, my mind drifted away from the dark parking lot and traveled back to a sunlit bedroom smelling of medicinal, sterile wipes and wilted orchids. It was just 4 weeks ago. I was gently wiping a warm, soapy washcloth over my grandfather's frail arms. Harrison Thorne, the titan of Hawaiian hospitality, looked incredibly fragile among the stark white medical sheets. His usually booming voice had faded into a raspy whisper. While my father and brother were downtown attending board meetings, claiming they were too busy to witness the decline, I spent my afternoons ensuring the patriarch maintained his dignity. I remembered him reaching out with a trembling hand, stopping my wrist. He gestured toward the bedside table where a cheap blue plastic ballpoint pen rested next to his water pitcher. The cap was heavily chewed. It was an ordinary disposable item, entirely out of place in a room filled with imported silk and mahogany. He told me to hand it to him. When I placed the plastic cylinder in his palm, he did not write anything. Instead, he pressed it back into my own hand, wrapping his thin fingers around mine. He looked at me with eyes that suddenly held the fierce, sharp intelligence of his youth. "Watch how men act when they think no one is keeping score," he whispered. The raspy tone carried immense weight. "Keep this pen, Riley. You will need it to write the final chapter." I had tucked the plastic item into my apron pocket, thinking it was just the rambling sentiment of a dying man. I kept it in my duffel bag ever since, a small, tactile memory of my final days with him. A sudden buzzing sound pulled me out of the memory. The harsh glare of my phone screen illuminated the dark cabin of the Wrangler. A text message notification flashed across the display. The sender was Chase. I hesitated before swiping to open the message. My brother rarely texted me unless he needed someone to pick up his dry cleaning or wanted to complain about the service at one of our grandfather's properties. The message was long. I read the words, and my stomach plummeted into a cold abyss. Chase wrote that he was sorting through the files in the estate study and found a drafted letter. According to him, Harrison had dictated a note to his private secretary shortly before passing. Chase claimed the draft stated our grandfather was suffering from severe dementia-induced paranoia. The text read that Harrison believed I was slowly stealing from his medical funds to support the Marine Rescue Center. Chase typed that the $60 was not a puzzle or a mistake. It was a calculated insult, a final statement from a paranoid old man ensuring I received nothing of value because he despised my supposed theft. Chase ended the message with a cruel sign-off. He wrote that he was sorry I had to find out this way, but I needed to face reality. He told me to stop pretending the silver certificates were special and just hand them over to his buyer before things got ugly. The phone dropped from my grip, landing on the floorboard. The faint yellow light of the screen cast long shadows across the dashboard. A suffocating wave of doubt washed over me. My vision blurred as tears I had fought all day finally threatened to spill. Dementia was a cruel thief. During those final months, Harrison had experienced moments of intense confusion. There were afternoons when he did not recognize the hospice nurses. There were evenings when he accused the dietary staff of poisoning his meals. It was a brutal symptom of his failing health. Could Chase be telling the truth? Did my grandfather experience a paranoid delusion about me right at the end? Did the man I bathed and comforted truly believe I was robbing him? The thought that Harrison died hating me felt like a physical knife twisting in my ribs. It made a sick kind of sense. Leaving a devoted caretaker $60 was an act of profound spite. It explained my father's smug smile at the law office. It explained why they felt so comfortable throwing my belongings onto the lawn. They thought I was a thief disguised as a saint. I leaned my forehead against the steering wheel, letting the despair sink in. All those hours of skipping meals to rush to his bedside, all the dates I canceled, the youth I sacrificed, while my brother partied on yachts funded by corporate accounts. Was it all rewarded with a delusion-fueled rejection? For 10 minutes, the beach parking lot felt like a tomb. I was ready to surrender. I considered driving to the resort headquarters the next morning, tossing the vintage bills at my brother's feet, and disappearing to the mainland. But something inside my chest refused to yield. I sat up, wiping my face with the back of my sleeve. I thought about the man who built an empire. Harrison Thorne did not make decisions based on fleeting paranoia. Even in his darkest moments of cognitive decline, his core personality remained rooted in logic and strategy. He loved puzzles. He loved testing people. And more importantly, I remembered the clear, lucid look in his eyes when he handed me that chewed-up pen. That was not the gaze of a man lost in a delusion. That was the gaze of an architect, laying a foundation. Chase was lying. It was a classic misdirection tactic, a red herring designed to shatter my confidence. My brother knew that if he could make me doubt my grandfather's love, I would surrender the currency without a fight. Chase needed those bills to cover his own catastrophic financial mistakes, and he was willing to weaponize a dying man's memory to get them. I reached into my work bag and pulled out the small magnifying glass I used for inspecting coral polyps. Then I reached deeper into the side pocket and retrieved the cheap blue plastic pen Harrison had given me. I clicked on the dome light once more. I pulled the white envelope from my jacket and extracted the 3 silver certificates. Earlier, I had noticed the microscopic circles and jotted down a rough sequence on a scrap of paper. But doubt required absolute verification. I needed to see it again to prove to myself that the puzzle was real and Chase's text was a desperate fabrication. I held the lens close to the textured paper. The tiny crimson marks leaped into view. They were undeniably deliberate. Someone had taken immense care to highlight specific numbers across the 3 pieces of currency. Using the very pen Harrison gave me, I began to transcribe the digits onto the back of a Marine Center flyer. I wrote slowly, ensuring every number was perfect. The ink flowed smoothly from the chewed plastic cylinder. 7, 0, 4, 1, 2. The sequence grew longer. As the pattern emerged, my doubt evaporated. The numbers formed a standard routing code used by high-tier financial institutions, but it did not match any of the commercial retail banks located in downtown Honolulu. It did not match the firm handling the Thorne estate probate. I stared at the finished string of digits. I recognized the prefix. Years ago, during a rare dinner where my grandfather discussed his early investments, he mentioned a specific private wealth management firm, a fortress for the ultra-rich located behind unmarked doors in the financial district. They did not cater to standard accounts. They managed generational wealth, blind trusts, and off-the-books holding companies. Pacific Crest Wealth Management. The silver certificates were not an insult born of paranoia. They were a physical verification key, a map to a hidden door that my father and brother knew nothing about. The $60 was the most valuable asset Harrison Thorne left behind. Chase had tried to blind me with a lie because he sensed his own incoming ruin. His venture capital debts were suffocating him, and he was grasping at shadows, hoping to find a lifeline. He assumed I was a naive girl who would break at the first sign of emotional manipulation. I clicked the cheap blue pen closed and tucked it safely into my pocket, alongside the vintage bills. The cold air of the Jeep no longer bothered me. A fire was burning steady and bright in my chest. The puzzle was solved, and the red herring lay dead in the water. I looked out at the rolling black waves of the Pacific Ocean. The sun would rise in a few hours, bringing the dawn of a very different reality. My family thought they had successfully locked me out of the kingdom. They had no idea I was holding the coordinates to the vault. Tomorrow morning, I would walk into the most exclusive building in Hawaii, and I would demand answers. What exactly was waiting for me behind those unmarked doors? The first rays of the Hawaiian sun pierced the windshield of my Jeep, casting a harsh glare across the dashboard. I woke up with a stiff neck and a dull ache in my lower back. The coastal air had turned humid overnight, leaving a thin layer of condensation on the inside of the glass. Outside, the morning commuters were already filling the Kamehameha Highway, their tires humming a steady rhythm against the asphalt. I sat up and rubbed the grit from my eyes. The events of the previous day, the law office, the $60 insult, the illegal lockout, felt like a fever dream. But the cramped reality of my back seat and the box of marine biology textbooks resting against my knee proved otherwise. I picked up the notepad from the passenger seat. The sequence of numbers I had transcribed in the dark stared back at me in the fresh daylight. 70412, followed by a long string of specific digits. In the clarity of the morning, the structure of the code made perfect sense. The first 9 numbers formed a specialized routing code. The remaining alphanumeric characters represented a private vault sequence. My grandfather had intentionally bypassed the estate lawyers entirely. Harrison Thorne knew that Mr. Davis, the attorney handling the probate, was a man whose loyalty could be bought. Richard, my father, had likely promised Davis a lucrative retainer to manage the resort empire once the transfer was complete. Harrison understood that any traditional inheritance left to me would be contested, delayed, or buried in endless legal filings by my family. So he built a back door, a silent, hidden path that required no lawyers, no probate court, and no public record. I folded the notepad and slipped it into my pocket, alongside the vintage silver certificates and the chewed blue plastic pen. I climbed into the driver's seat and turned the ignition. The old engine sputtered for a few seconds before roaring to life. I did not have time to find a gym shower or change my clothes. I was still wearing the wrinkled Marine Center polo and faded denim shorts from yesterday. My canvas sneakers were scuffed with dried mud. I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the rearview mirror. Dark circles framed my eyes, and my hair was a tangled mess from sleeping on a rolled-up sleeping bag. I looked exactly like the failure my father and brother believed me to be. I looked defeated. But beneath the exhausted exterior, a new, steady pulse hammered in my chest. I drove away from the beach, navigating the morning traffic toward the heart of downtown Honolulu. The scenery shifted from swaying palm trees and open beaches to towering monoliths of steel and glass. The financial district was a different world. It was a concrete canyon where the island's wealth was shielded, traded, and multiplied. I found a parking garage on Bishop Street, squeezing my battered Wrangler between a sleek black Mercedes and a pristine Range Rover. Stepping out into the humid city air, I felt the staggering weight of the environment. This was my father's territory. This was where men in tailored suits made decisions that altered skylines. I was an intruder here. I walked 2 blocks until I reached my destination. The building did not have a grand neon sign or a flashing digital ticker. It projected power through restraint. A single discrete plaque made of brushed steel was mounted beside a set of heavy tinted glass doors. It read, Pacific Crest Wealth Management. This was the institution Harrison mentioned in passing years ago. They did not offer checking accounts or mortgage loans. They catered exclusively to ultra-high net worth individuals managing off-the-books holding companies and generational trusts. I pushed through the heavy glass doors, and the climate instantly shifted. The air inside was freezing and smelled of expensive floor wax and polished leather. The lobby was designed to intimidate. Soaring ceilings, acoustics that swallowed every footstep, and a sweeping desk carved from a single slab of dark imported marble dominated the space. A receptionist sat behind the marble counter. She wore a pristine ivory blazer, her hair pinned into an immaculate twist. As I approached her, fingers paused over her keyboard. Her gaze swept over my wrinkled polo, my bare legs, and my muddy sneakers. Her posture stiffened. "May I help you find your way?" she asked. Her tone was coated in a polite corporate frost. The subtext was clear. You are lost, and you do not belong here. I stepped up to the counter, planting my boots firmly into the plush carpet. "I need to see the branch manager," I said, keeping my voice level. "I am here to see David Cole." The receptionist's perfectly arched eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. A tight, dismissive smile touched her lips. "Mr. Cole does not take walk-in appointments," she explained, speaking slowly as if I had trouble understanding English. "He handles private portfolios. If you are looking for retail banking services, there is a commercial branch 3 blocks down the street." I did not move. "I am not looking for a retail bank," I replied, "and I am not leaving until I speak with him." The polite frost vanished, leaving only cold irritation. She leaned closer to her microphone console. "Miss, this is a private facility. You are disrupting our environment. I will ask you one more time to exit the premises before I am forced to call security." My father and brother had spent my entire life dismissing me. They trained me to shrink, to apologize for taking up space, and to quietly accept whatever scraps they threw my way. For 28 years, I played the role of the compliant, quiet caretaker. That role died last night in a beach parking lot. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the white envelope. I extracted the 3 vintage $20 bills. With a swift, deliberate motion, I slapped the silver certificates onto the pristine marble counter. The crisp paper produced a sharp snapping sound that echoed through the silent lobby. "Call him," I said, my voice dropping an octave. "Tell David Cole that Harrison Thorne sent me." The receptionist glared at the currency as if I had just placed garbage on her desk. She reached for her console and pressed a red button. A door down the side corridor clicked open. A security guard wearing a tailored dark suit stepped into the lobby. He was broad-shouldered and moved with alarming speed. He approached me, his hand resting near his hip. "It is time to go," Miss the guard said. His voice was a low rumble echoing off the marble floors. He stepped within an arm's length, reaching out to grab my shoulder. I did not flinch. I kept my eyes locked on the receptionist, pointing a single finger at the vintage bills on the counter. "Look at the serial numbers," I demanded. The guard grabbed my upper arm, his grip like a steel vise. He began to pull me backward toward the tinted glass doors. Before he could drag me another step, a heavy mahogany door behind the reception desk swung open. A man stepped out into the lobby. He wore a charcoal suit that fit with surgical precision. His silver hair was combed back, and his expression was etched with deep annoyance. This was David Cole. "What is the meaning of this disturbance?" Cole asked. His sharp voice cut through the tension, bringing the security guard to a halt. "We have clients in the conference room." The receptionist stood up quickly, smoothing her ivory blazer. "I apologize, Mr. Cole. This vagrant wandered in, demanding to see you. Security is removing her right now." Cole turned his attention to me. His eyes swept over my disheveled appearance, registering the same disdain the receptionist had shown. He opened his mouth, prepared to order the guard to throw me out onto the pavement. But as he stepped forward, his gaze drifted downward. He noticed the 3 green bills resting on the dark marble. The irritation drained from his face in a fraction of a second. His breathing stopped. He leaned over the counter, staring at the specific sequence of digits and the microscopic crimson ink circling the numbers. The guard tugged my arm again, preparing to pull me outside. "Stop," Cole commanded. His voice trembled, lacking all the corporate authority he possessed just seconds ago. The guard froze, releasing his grip on my shoulder. The receptionist blinked, staring at her boss in total confusion. David Cole slowly lifted his head and looked at me. The disdain was gone. In its place was a mixture of profound shock and deep, unsettling respect. He stood frozen behind the marble desk, staring at the girl in the wrinkled polo shirt who had just laid out the key to his most guarded vault. The lobby of Pacific Crest Wealth Management fell into a sudden, suffocating quiet. The ambient noise of the city outside seemed to vanish behind the thick, tinted glass. David Cole, a man who managed the fortunes of tech billionaires and real estate tycoons, remained frozen behind the reception counter. He did not blink. His gaze was anchored to the 3 vintage silver certificates resting on the dark marble. The security guard stood beside me, his hands still hovering in the air. He looked at his boss, waiting for the command to throw me out onto Bishop Street. The receptionist sat with her mouth slightly open, the polite corporate frost shattering into pure confusion. "Stand down," Cole ordered. His voice was barely a whisper, but it carried a weight that commanded instant obedience. The guard stepped back, lowering his hands and nodding once. He retreated to his post down the side corridor, leaving me alone at the desk. Cole slowly lifted his head. The annoyance that had carved deep lines into his forehead just seconds prior was entirely gone. He looked at my wrinkled Marine Center polo, my scuffed canvas sneakers, and my exhausted face. But he did not see a vagrant. He saw the puzzle pieces snapping into place. Without uttering a single word to his staff, Cole walked around the marble counter. He moved with a stiff, mechanical urgency. He bypassed me and marched straight to the heavy glass front doors of the institution. He reached into his suit jacket, produced a brass key, and turned the deadbolt. A loud, mechanical click echoed through the room. He flipped the small sign hanging in the window from open to closed. The receptionist stood up her chair, scraping loudly against the floor. "Mr. Cole, we have the regional directors arriving in 10 minutes, she stammered. "Cancel them," Cole replied, his back still turned. "Cancel every appointment for the rest of the day." He turned around and walked back toward me. He gestured toward the heavy mahogany door leading to his private suite. "Please follow me, Miss Alexander," he said. His tone was coated in a profound, unsettling reverence. I picked up the 3 bills, sliding them back into the white envelope. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I followed him across the plush carpet, leaving a faint trail of dried mud from my boots. We entered his office. The space smelled of rich leather-aged scotch and expensive cedar. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the Honolulu skyline, but Cole immediately pressed a button on his desk. Heavy motorized blinds descended, plunging the room into dim shadows, lit only by a sleek desk lamp. "Please sit," he offered, pointing to a high-backed leather chair. I remained standing. My hands were trembling slightly, and I needed to feel the solid ground beneath my feet. I survived the night in a cold Jeep and endured the cruelty of my family. I was not going to relax now. Cole rounded his desk and opened a hidden drawer. He pulled out a small black electronic terminal, placing it carefully next to his gold nameplate. "May I see your identification?" he asked. I reached into my pocket and handed over my standard Hawaii driver's license. The plastic was worn at the edges. Cole did not examine it with his eyes. He slid the card into a slot on the black terminal. The machine whirred, scanning the magnetic strip and the barcode. He then typed a long alphanumeric sequence into the keypad. A green light illuminated the device. A small receipt printer embedded in the machine spat out a slip of paper. Cole tore it off, reading the text. He exhaled a long, shaky breath. He set the paper down and looked up at me. "Your grandfather was a brilliant man," Miss Alexander Cole said. His voice was thick with emotion. He built safeguards into his empire that even his closest advisors never fully understood. Those 3 bills you brought in today are not currency. They are a physical verification key. I reached into my pocket, grasping the envelope. My brother thought they were just old collector items, I replied, keeping my tone guarded. Cole offered a dry, humorless smile. Harrison procured those specific silver certificates over a decade ago. The red ink circling the serial numbers is a proprietary chemical dye. It registers under our internal scanning equipment. He created this failsafe 5 years ago when his health first began to decline. Cole leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished cedar. He told me the estate attorneys would handle the loud money, the resorts, the liquid cash, the public accounts. But he needed a secure blind channel for his true legacy. Harrison said his son and his grandson measured a person's worth by the size of their bank accounts. He knew they would scoff at a meager $60. He knew they would toss it aside without a second thought. Cole paused, letting the silence stretch. Then he repeated a phrase that made my breath catch. He said the one who did not complain about the $60 would be the one to find the code Cole whispered. He said the person who kept the paper would be the only one observant enough to notice the red ink and patient enough to follow the coordinates. The words hit me with the force of a tidal wave. The psychological torment of the past 24 hours, the illegal eviction, the humiliation in the law office, the crippling doubt I felt in the parking lot, suddenly fractured. I was not crazy. I was not a failure. My grandfather had orchestrated an elaborate theatrical test to filter out the greed in his own bloodline. He had watched my father Richard and my brother Chase operate with unearned privilege. He knew they lacked the discipline to look closely at anything that did not sparkle. "Are you ready to see what he left you?" Cole asked. I nodded, unable to find the words. Cole stood and walked to the far wall of his office. He pushed aside a framed landscape painting, revealing a seamless steel panel. He pressed his palm against a biometric scanner. The panel slid open with a soft pneumatic hiss, exposing a small, private elevator. We stepped inside. There were no buttons. The doors glided shut, and the cabin immediately began a rapid descent. The pressure in my ears shifted, indicating we were dropping far below the street level of the financial district. I stood next to the titan of Pacific Crest Wealth Management, feeling the incredible shift in power. Hours ago, I was homeless. Now I was sinking into the subterranean belly of the island elite. The elevator decelerated, and the doors opened into a sprawling underground vault. The air was frigid. Sleek glass walls housed rows of secure servers and titanium safe deposit boxes. Standing in the center of the room waiting for us was a woman. She wore a tailored charcoal pantsuit that's sharp and unforgiving. Her dark hair was cut into a sleek bob, and her posture radiated an intense, ruthless authority. She held a thick leather binder under her arm. "This is Victoria Sterling Cole," said, breaking the silence. "She is the lead trust attorney for the Thorn contingencies." Victoria stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the polished concrete floor. She did not offer a warm smile or a comforting handshake. She assessed me with piercing, analytical eyes, dissecting my exhausted appearance. "You cut it close, Riley," Victoria said. Her voice was crisp and highly measured. "I've been sitting in this vault for 48 hours. Harrison stipulated a strict window. If you had not deciphered the code and presented the bills by noon today, the contingencies would have dissolved. Every asset down here would have been irrevocably donated to international charities." A cold shiver ran down my spine. The stakes were far higher than I realized. If I had thrown the bills away in anger or handed them over to Chase, the door would have locked forever. "Your father and your brother are predictable men," Victoria continued, pacing slowly around me. "They react to bright, shiny objects. They make noise. Harrison needed someone who could sit in the quiet. He needed someone with the emotional restraint to endure an insult without losing their focus." She stopped in front of me, holding out the leather binder. The tension that had coiled around my chest since the will reading finally snapped, giving way to a profound, undeniable validation. My grandfather had seen my quiet caretaking not as a weakness, but as the ultimate strength. He trusted me with his secrets because he knew I would not break. I reached out and took the heavy binder from her hands. The leather felt cool and substantial. You passed the test, Riley. Victoria said, her sharp features softening just a fraction. You proved you do not share your father's arrogance or your brother's greed. Now it is time to discuss the reality of your position. I looked down at the embossed cover of the binder. My heart pounded a fierce new rhythm. I had unlocked the door. I had survived the gauntlet. But as I opened the cover to read the first page, I realized the true challenge had not even begun. What exactly was Harrison Thorne hiding deep beneath the concrete of Honolulu? I opened the heavy leather cover. The first page was not a bank statement or a stock portfolio. It was a property deed printed on thick, cream-colored paper. It bore the official embossed seal of the Hawaiian Land Registry. Victoria Sterling stood a few feet away, watching my eyes scan the text. Your father and your brother walked out of that law office yesterday believing they had inherited the kingdom, she said, her voice sharp and echoing in the subterranean space. They inherited the resort operations, Riley. They control the brand name, the payroll, the marketing, and the room service. I looked up from the document. The operations, I repeated, trying to grasp the distinction. Victoria nodded. They own the buildings, but they do not own the dirt beneath them. Harrison Thorne was a visionary who understood the fundamental rule of island real estate. Buildings depreciate. Land is finite. For the past 5 years, while your father was busy schmoozing investors and assuming his succession was guaranteed, Harrison was quietly restructuring the core foundation of the empire. Victoria stepped closer, tapping a manicured fingernail against the deed in my hands. He transferred the title for the acreage beneath all 7 coastal properties: the Waikiki flagship, the Maui retreat, the Kauai golf expanse. Every single square foot of prime oceanfront real estate was quietly deeded to a holding company called Pacific Apex LLC. I flipped to the second page of the binder. There it was, the Articles of Incorporation for Pacific Apex. Pacific Apex is not a standard corporation, Victoria explained. It is an irrevocable, blind trust. The beneficiary is hidden from public record, immune to standard probate inquiries, and entirely shielded from corporate creditors. She paused, letting the silence stretch, before delivering the final blow. You are the sole beneficiary, Riley. My knees suddenly felt unable to support my weight. I gripped the edge of a nearby titanium table to steady myself. The sheer scale of the revelation was staggering. I had spent my entire adult life budgeting a modest nonprofit salary, clipping coupons, and repairing an old Jeep. Now, I was holding the deeds to the most coveted real estate in the Pacific Ocean. What is the valuation? I asked, my voice trembling, despite my best efforts to keep it level. Conservative estimates place the raw land value at $400 million. Victoria replied without blinking. Furthermore, the operational side of the Thorne Resorts, the side your father now controls, is legally bound by century-long leases. They must pay monthly rent to Pacific Apex to keep their doors open. The reality washed over me like a cold wave. Richard and Chase thought they had won. They thought they had cast me out into poverty. But in truth, my father and my brother now worked for me. I was their landlord. Harrison gave you the ultimate leverage. Victoria continued pacing slowly across the concrete floor. He knew Richard would run the operations into the ground if left unchecked. He knew Chase would try to leverage the company to pay off his bad debts. He put the land in your hands so you could either save the legacy or let them drown in their own incompetence. I stared at the paperwork, feeling a profound sense of awe. My grandfather had orchestrated a masterpiece of financial engineering. But there is a catch, Victoria said, stopping in front of me, her sharp, analytical gaze locked onto mine. A very strict condition you must follow. I braced myself. What is the condition? You cannot tell them, she instructed. You cannot reveal your identity as the owner of Pacific Apex for exactly 30 days. I frowned, confused. Why 30 days? Because your father is a ruthless man with very expensive litigators, Victoria explained. Right now, the probate courts are processing the transition of the operations. If Richard discovers that the land was stripped from his inheritance before the estate settles, he will file immediate emergency injunctions. He will claim Harrison was senile. He will drag this trust into a grueling, decade-long legal battle, trying to drain your resources. She crossed her arms. I need 30 days to file the final international privacy shields. I need a 4-week window to build an impenetrable legal wall around Pacific Apex, so that when Richard finally realizes he does not own the ground he stands on, he will have zero legal recourse. Until the clock runs out on that probationary period, your name must remain invisible. I understood the strategy. It was a brilliant defensive maneuver. But the personal cost was steep. That means I have to remain the family failure, I said softly. I have to let them think I am destitute. Victoria nodded, her expression softening just a fraction. It means you will endure psychological warfare. They will try to break you, Riley. They will parade their new wealth. They will insult you, and they will try to make you beg. You must endure their cruelty without ever playing your card. Can you handle that? I thought about the illegal lockout last night. I thought about shivering in the back of my Wrangler while my brother demanded my pocket change. They wanted me to break. They wanted to see me surrender. But I was no longer a victim. I was a landowner playing a high-stakes game of chess. The dramatic irony of the situation forged a shield of armor around my chest. Let them insult me. Let them flaunt their fake superiority. Every cruel word they spoke would only make the final reveal sweeter. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the chewed blue plastic pen, the very pen Harrison handed to me on his deathbed. Where do I sign? I asked. Victoria offered a rare, genuine smile. She opened the binder to the final signature page outlining the non-disclosure agreement and the trust acceptance. I pressed the blue plastic tip to the paper and signed my name. The ascent back to the surface felt entirely different than the ride down. I stood in the private elevator alongside David Cole, watching the floor numbers tick upward. I was no longer the exhausted girl who walked into the lobby begging for an audience. I was the largest private landowner in Honolulu. Cole escorted me through the lobby. The receptionist, who had threatened to call security earlier, kept her eyes glued to her keyboard, refusing to look at me. The security guard stood rigidly at attention. Cole opened the heavy tinted glass doors for me. "Stay safe, Miss Alexander," he said. "We will be in touch." I stepped out onto Bishop Street. The midday sun was blinding, and the humidity wrapped around me like a heavy blanket. The bustling noise of the city rushed back into my ears. Horns honked, pedestrians rushed past, and the scent of exhaust fumes filled the air. I walked toward the parking garage, feeling a strange, surreal calm. I was a billionaire, sleeping in a beat-up Jeep. Just as I reached my vehicle, my phone began to vibrate in my pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. The caller identification displayed my father's name, Richard Thorne. My thumb hovered over the accept button. The 30-day probationary period had officially begun. I took a deep breath, letting the reality of my hidden power settle into my posture. I swiped the screen and lifted the phone to my ear. "Hello, Richard," I answered, keeping my tone neutral. Riley, his voice boomed through the speaker, dripping with unearned superiority. "I hope you found a comfortable park bench last night. Chase mentioned you were a bit uncooperative at the guest house." I stared at the cracked dashboard of my Wrangler. "I am fine," I replied. "What do you want?" "I am calling to offer you a lesson in reality," Richard said. "You see, the resort board is conducting a thorough review of our philanthropic expenditures. It seems Harrison was funneling quite a bit of cash into that little marine center of yours." My grip on the steering wheel tightened. "I am restructuring our budget," Richard continued, his tone turning cold. "And I do not see the return on investment for saving injured pelicans. I suggest you come to my office tomorrow morning. If you offer a genuine apology to your brother and agree to a more suitable position, say a junior concierge role, I might reconsider cutting your funding. The trap was set. My father was using the only thing I cared about to force me onto my knees. He thought he held all the leverage. He had no idea he was speaking to the entity that held the deed to his entire kingdom. "I will think about it," I said softly. "Do not think too long, Riley. The clock is ticking." He ended the call. I lowered the phone, staring at the dark screen. He was right about one thing. The clock was ticking, and when the alarm finally sounded, it was going to obliterate his entire world. The drive to the Thorn Resort corporate headquarters felt like crossing an invisible border into a hostile nation. The towering glass and steel structure overlooked the pristine crescent of Waikiki Beach, projecting an aura of untouchable wealth. I pulled my mud-splattered Jeep Wrangler into the circular valet driveway. The parking attendants, wearing crisp white linen uniforms, stopped and stared. I handed my keys to a young valet whose eyes darted from my wrinkled Marine Center polo to the cracked dashboard of my vehicle. He took the keys with a hesitant nod, sliding a premium parking ticket under the windshield wiper. Walking through the grand revolving doors, I was immediately hit by a wall of freezing air conditioning. The lobby smelled of fresh hibiscus and expensive floor polish. Polished travertine tiles echoed beneath my scuffed canvas sneakers. Every person in my line of sight wore tailored designer clothing, moving with the hurried self-importance that defined my father's world. I ignored their sideways glances and stepped into the executive elevator, swiping my old family access card. I held my breath, hoping Richard had not deactivated it yet. The button for the penthouse illuminated, glowing a soft blue. When the doors parted on the top floor, I stepped onto a plush wool carpet. The hallway was silent, but a booming voice drifted from the primary boardroom at the far end of the corridor. It was Richard. I walked quietly toward the open double doors. My father stood at the head of a long, polished mahogany table. 5 senior executives sat rigid in their ergonomic chairs, typing frantically on sleek laptops. Richard paced behind them, running a hand through his graying hair. "I do not care what the mainland lenders want," Richard barked, his tone echoing off the acoustic ceiling panels. "The commercial bridge loans were supposed to clear yesterday. Now you are telling me the bank is freezing the transition capital because of a land use audit?" A nervous executive adjusted his glasses, speaking in a cautious tremor. "Sir, the underwriters are insisting on a comprehensive deed verification. They need to confirm the exact holding structures for the coastal acreage beneath the resorts before they authorize the $30 million release." Richard slammed his fist onto the mahogany table, causing the executives to flinch. "It is a pathetic bureaucratic stall tactic," he snapped. "We own the dirt. We have owned this acreage for 40 years. My father built these foundations. Tell the bank to push the paperwork through, or I will pull our operational accounts and move to a competitor by Friday." I stood in the doorway listening to his arrogant demands. A cold, satisfying shiver ran down my spine. The mainland banks were already sniffing the perimeter. They were digging into the collateral and encountering the invisible wall Harrison had constructed. Richard assumed it was just annoying red tape. He had zero comprehension that the holding structure the bank was searching for was Pacific Apex. He had no idea the deed to the dirt he stood on was resting in a subterranean vault under my name. The sheer irony of his bluster was intoxicating. Richard dismissed the room with a sharp wave of his hand. The executives scrambled out of their chairs, gathering their files. They filed past me, keeping their heads down, eager to escape his wrath. Once the room was empty, Richard poured himself a glass of sparkling water from a crystal carafe. He took a slow sip and finally turned his attention to me. His eyes swept over my exhausted posture, the dark circles under my eyes, and the wrinkles in my shirt. He offered a slow, theatrical sigh. "I'm glad you decided to show up, Riley," he said, leaning against the edge of the boardroom table, "though you could have showered first. I see the reality of your new living situation is taking its toll." I stepped into the room, refusing to shrink under his gaze. "You said you wanted to discuss the rescue center," I replied, keeping my voice steady. He set his glass down. "Yes, The Rescue Center, your little charity project. He walked around the table, closing the distance between us. You see, Harrison indulged your hobbies because he was a sentimental old man. But I run a business, and business requires leverage. The municipal grants that keep your fish tanks filtering water and your staff paid are authorized by the city council. I play golf with 3 of those councilmen every Sunday. He tilted his head, feigning a sympathetic expression. I made a few calls this morning, Riley. I explained that the Thorne estate is restructuring its philanthropic commitments. I suggested that the city might want to reallocate their marine conservation grants toward more lucrative tourist developments. My heart hammered against my ribs. The Marine Rescue Center was not a hobby. It was a lifeline for the fragile coastal ecosystem. We rehabilitated monk seals injured by boat propellers and nursed sea turtles tangled in commercial fishing nets. We gave drowning creatures a second chance to breathe. My father and my brother operated on the exact opposite spectrum. They found joy in pushing people underwater and watching them gasp for air. They drowned their rivals in debt and cruelty to inflate their own egos. If they pull that municipal funding, the center will go under, I said. We cannot cover the overhead on private donations alone. Richard smiled a chilling, predatory expression. I know, he whispered. That is the entire point. He crossed his arms, delivering his ultimatum. You have until tomorrow morning to make a choice. You will record a video formally apologizing to Chase for your ungrateful behavior. Then you will put on a Thorne Resort housekeeping uniform. I have a position open at the Maui Retreat, scrubbing toilets on the 3rd floor. You will learn the value of hard work. If you do this, I will make a call and save your little fish hospital. If you refuse, the center dies today. He expected tears. He expected me to fall to my knees and beg for the lives of the animals and the jobs of my colleagues. He wanted to break my spirit and bind me to his will. I stared into his eyes, seeing the deep, hollow void where his conscience should have been. The urge to scream the truth at him burned in my throat. I wanted to tell him that I was the landowner. I wanted to watch his smug face crumble as he realized I held the power to evict his entire corporate staff. But I remembered Victoria Sterling standing in the freezing vault. You must endure their cruelty without ever playing your card. The 30-day probationary period was a legal shield. If I spoke the truth now, Richard would launch an emergency injunction and tie the trust up in probate court for a decade. I had to swallow the poison and remain silent. I will let you know my decision, I said, turning on my heel and walking out of the boardroom. Richard laughed behind me. Do not take too long, Riley. I rode the elevator down in a daze. I retrieved my Jeep from the valet and drove aimlessly along the coastal highway, needing the salty ocean wind to clear the suffocating anger from my lungs. I parked at a scenic overlook, watching the turquoise waves crash against the dark volcanic rocks below. My cell phone rang, vibrating against the center console. The caller identification showed the name of my boss, Dr. Evans, the director of the rescue center. I answered the call, dreading the sound of his voice. Riley, he said, his words thick and broken, I do not know what is happening. I closed my eyes, resting my head against the headrest. Tell me, I whispered. The city council just sent over an emergency notice, Dr. Evans explained, fighting back a sob. They revoked our annual operating grant, effective immediately. They claimed a sudden budget shortfall. Riley, that grant pays for our filtration, electricity, and our veterinary medicine. If we cannot secure replacement funding by Friday, we have to close our doors. We will have to transfer the critical animals to mainland facilities, and most of them will not survive the flight. The devastation in his voice tore through my chest. My physical homelessness was just a minor inconvenience compared to this. My father was systematically destroying my purpose. He was punishing innocent creatures and dedicated scientists just to feed his own inflated pride. I told Dr. Evans to hold the line and stay strong. I promised him I would find a way to fix it. I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. I sat in my makeshift bedroom on wheels, gripping the steering wheel until my hands ached. I was the secret owner of a $400 million empire. I had unlimited resources resting in a hidden subterranean trust. But my hands were legally tied behind my back. I could not sign a check with my own name. I could not walk into the city council and demand they restore the grant without exposing Pacific Apex to my father's ruthless litigators. The stakes were intensely personal, and the clock was rapidly ticking toward Friday. The animals were going to suffer, and my colleagues were going to lose their livelihoods. Richard thought he had trapped me in an impossible corner. He believed I had to surrender my dignity to save my center. I stared out at the endless expanse of the Pacific Ocean, my mind racing through the constraints of the 30-day gag order. There had to be a way to strike back invisibly. I needed to move capital without leaving a footprint. I needed a ghost. The crashing waves against the volcanic rocks mirrored the chaotic rhythm of my heartbeat. I sat in the driver's seat of my Wrangler, staring at the digital clock on the dashboard. My father wanted a response by tomorrow morning. He thought a ticking clock would force me into submission. He thought poverty and desperation would strip away my principles and bind me to his authority. I picked up my cell phone. I did not call Richard to beg for my job. I dialed the direct secure number David Cole had provided for Victoria Sterling. The line rang twice before the sharp, crisp voice of the trust attorney answered. I explained the situation, keeping my tone clinical and detached. I detailed the municipal grant revocation, the immediate threat to the Marine Rescue Center, and the specific blackmail attempt my father just delivered in his boardroom. Victoria listened in silence. When I finished speaking, I asked her if Pacific Apex could intervene without triggering the probationary disclosure clause. Victoria let out a low, appreciative hum. She told me that while my personal identity must remain shielded, the trust itself functioned as a fully operational corporate entity. It possessed its own charitable arm, designed specifically for tax diversion and philanthropic investments. She said she could route a substantial capital injection through an anonymous shell corporation, rendering the origin untraceable to my father or his mainland lenders. I authorized the transaction immediately. I lowered the phone and leaned back against the headrest. The oppressive heat of the afternoon sun baked the interior of the Jeep, but I felt a profound cooling relief wash over my skin. For the first time in my life, I had fought back against my family. I did not use raised voices or slammed doors. I used the quiet, invisible architecture my grandfather left behind. The minutes crawled by. I watched a pair of seabirds dive into the turquoise surf, hunting for their next meal. 2 hours later, my phone vibrated against the passenger seat. The caller identification displayed Dr. Evans. I answered the call, bracing myself for his reaction. "Riley," his voice was breathless, trembling with an emotion that sounded remarkably like shock. I asked him what happened. He told me the center accountant just refreshed their institutional ledger. A wire transfer had cleared their pending deposits. It was not just a replacement for the municipal grant. An anonymous philanthropic syndicate had just endowed our facility with operational capital guaranteed for the next 20 years. They included excess funds specifically earmarked for a state-of-the-art surgical wing and a dedicated marine mammal rehabilitation pool. Dr. Evans was weeping openly. He said we were not closing, we were expanding. I allowed a genuine smile to spread across my face. I told him how happy I was, feigning pleasant surprise. I listened to his joyous rambling, feeling the heavy burden of my father's threat dissolve into nothing. The animals were safe, the staff retained their livelihoods, and Richard Thorne had just lost his greatest piece of leverage over my life. I drove away from the scenic overlook, heading toward a public beach park on the North Shore. I used the outdoor showers to rinse the sweat and grit from my skin, changing into a fresh set of clothes from my cardboard boxes. I brushed my wet hair and bought a simple sandwich from a local roadside vendor. The food tasted incredibly rich. Every bite was flavored with the distinct, satisfying taste of independence. I sat on a wooden picnic bench watching the tide roll in. The afternoon stretched into the early evening. I knew Richard would not wait until tomorrow morning to secure his victory. He was a man who craved immediate validation. He wanted to hear the defeat in my voice before he went to sleep. He wanted to savor his perceived dominance over my spirit. Right on cue, my phone lit up. Richard Thorne. I let it ring 3 times, regulating my breathing to ensure my tone remained perfectly neutral. I tapped the screen and brought the device to my ear. "Hello, Richard," I said. My father let out a slow, contented sigh. "Riley," he began, his voice coated in that familiar, cloying superiority. "I am calling to check on your progress. Have you recorded the apology video for Chase yet? I can send a tailor to your location to fit you for that housekeeping uniform. It is best to start your new reality looking presentable." I stared out at the horizon where the sun was beginning to dip below the waterline, casting long golden reflections across the waves. "I am not recording an apology," I replied, my voice calm and steady, "and I will not be accepting the housekeeping position." There was a brief pause on the line. Richard chuckled, a harsh, dry sound. "You are playing a very foolish game, Riley. I told you the municipal funding is gone. Your fish hospital is dead. Without that grant, your boss will be padlocking the doors by Friday. You have no money. You have no home. You have no options." I took a slow, deliberate breath. "You are right about the municipal funding," I said. "The city council did revoke the grant. But it seems the Marine Center no longer requires municipal assistance." The line went dead silent. "What are you talking about?" Richard demanded, the smugness instantly evaporating from his tone. I kept my voice entirely conversational, as if we were discussing the weather. "An anonymous philanthropic trust wired a permanent endowment to the center this afternoon," I explained. "They fully funded our operational budget for the next 20 years. They even provided capital to build a new surgical wing. The center is not closing, Richard. We are expanding." The silence that followed was heavy, thick, with an unspoken, frantic calculation. I could picture my father standing in his opulent penthouse office, staring at his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows. His entire strategy relied on the assumption that he was the wealthiest, most influential entity on the island. He believed he could snap his fingers and dictate the survival of any local institution. Now, someone had just casually outbid him, erasing his power without leaving a single fingerprint. "That is impossible," Richard snapped, his voice rising in pitch. "No one drops that kind of capital into a failing animal shelter without a press release. Who is the donor?" "I do not know," I replied, allowing a faint hint of amusement to color my words. "The wire transfer was strictly anonymous. I guess someone out there just really cares about injured pelicans." I hung up the phone before he could scream his next demand. I tossed the device onto the picnic table. A profound, quiet power settled into my bones. I did not need to raise my voice to win. I did not need to throw a tantrum or break a glass. The dramatic irony of the chess match was exquisite. Richard was now fighting a ghost. He was swinging his fists at the empty air, entirely unaware that the phantom outsmarting him was his homeless, disinherited daughter. But my father's failure to control me would not lead to surrender. It would push the internal panic of the Thorne family higher. Richard and Chase were already drowning in their mainland debt. Their inheritance was frozen in bureaucratic audits, waiting for deed verifications they could never provide. And now, a mysterious billionaire was funding their enemies right in their own backyard. I watched the final sliver of the sun disappear below the ocean, turning the sky a deep, bruised purple. My family was backed into a corner, and cornered predators always lash out. I had to prepare for their next move. What extreme measures would they resort to when the illusion of their control finally shattered? The morning after my silent counterstrike at the rescue center brought a strange, unsettling calm to my makeshift life in the Jeep. I drove to a small secluded beach near Haleiwa, avoiding the tourist-dense areas of the southern coast. The ocean breeze carried the scent of salt and blooming plumeria. I bought an iced coffee from a small wooden shack near the highway and sat at a weathered picnic table reviewing my schedule. The 30-day probationary period felt both agonizingly slow and dangerously fast. I was untouchable legally, but physically I was still sleeping on vinyl seats and washing my face in public restrooms. As I sipped my coffee, a sleek silver Porsche SUV pulled into the gravel parking lot. The vehicle looked entirely out of place among the rusted pickup trucks and surfboards. The driver's side door opened and a woman stepped out. She wore oversized designer sunglasses, a crisp white silk blouse, and tailored slacks that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. It was Lauren, Chase's wife. My immediate instinct was to stand up and walk away. Lauren was a woman who built her entire identity around the perceived status of the Thorne name. During family dinners, she frequently made passive-aggressive remarks about my modest nonprofit salary, comparing it to the exorbitant price tags of her imported handbags. She viewed me as a stain on the family portrait. But as she approached the picnic table, I noticed something alarming. The pristine facade she meticulously cultivated was cracking. Her steps were hurried, uneven. She kept glancing over her shoulder, scanning the highway, as if expecting someone to follow her. When she removed her sunglasses, her eyes were wide-rimmed with red and devoid of their usual mocking superiority. Lauren looked terrified. "Riley," she said, her voice a brittle, breathless whisper. She did not sneer. She did not offer a condescending greeting. She slid onto the wooden bench opposite me, gripping her expensive leather purse with white knuckles. I set my coffee cup down. "What are you doing here, Lauren? How did you find me?" "I paid a private investigator to track the license plate on your Wrangler," she confessed, her words rushing out in a frantic stream. "Do not tell Chase I am here. If he knows I am speaking to you, he will kill me." "Well, he might not kill me, but he will destroy my credit rating, and that is practically the same thing." I leaned back, crossing my arms. "You hired a private investigator to find your homeless sister-in-law? Why?" Lauren swallowed hard, looking down at the scarred wood of the table. "I need cash, Riley. Untraceable, physical cash. I know Richard cut you off and Chase threw you out, but you have always been frugal. You must have a savings account. A rainy day fund from that fish center? If you give me $10,000 right now, I will give you information that will explain everything. I will tell you exactly why your father and your brother are acting like cornered animals." A sharp, unexpected plot twist unfolded right there in the salty morning air. My sister-in-law, the woman who draped herself in luxury and mocked my frugality, was begging me for escape money. The irony was so thick I could almost taste it. "I do not have $10,000, I said, keeping my tone perfectly flat, and even if I did, I would not buy family gossip." "It is not gossip," Riley Lauren hissed, leaning forward across the table. Her desperation was palpable, raw, and unfiltered. "It is survival. You do not understand what is happening inside that penthouse. Chase is not the successful venture capitalist he pretends to be. His last 3 tech startups were fraudulent. He inflated the user metrics to secure further funding rounds." She opened her purse, her hands shaking so violently she dropped a tube of expensive lipstick onto the gravel. She ignored it, pulling out a thick manila folder filled with heavily redacted financial spreadsheets. "Chase is $30 million in debt," she whispered, sliding the folder across the table. "He owes that money to a ruthless private equity syndicate in Chicago. These are not standard commercial lenders, Riley. These are men who shatter kneecaps and file aggressive civil asset forfeiture claims. They want their capital returned with exorbitant interest by the end of the fiscal quarter." I stared at the folder, refusing to touch the documents. "Why are you telling me this, Lauren?" "Chase inherited $20 million from Harrison. That should cover the majority of his deficit." Lauren let out a sharp, humorless laugh. It sounded like glass breaking. "The $20 million is frozen in the probate process," she explained, her eyes wide with panic. "And even if it clears, it is not enough. The syndicate demanded hard collateral to extend his loan terms last year. Chase did not have collateral. So he convinced your father to co-sign the debt. Richard put up the resort real estate deeds as the guarantee." The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with a deafening internal roar. The seemingly random cruelty, the illegal eviction, the desperation for the $60 vintage bills. My father and my brother were not just arrogant. They were standing on the edge of total financial annihilation. "The mainland banks are conducting a land use audit to verify the collateral," Lauren continued, her voice dropping to a frantic murmur. "If the auditors discover any irregularities, the private equity firm will call the loan immediately. Richard and Chase will face total bankruptcy. The syndicate will seize the operational accounts, the brand name, and the physical assets. There are federal fraud charges hovering over Chase's head for the inflated metrics." She reached across the table, grabbing my wrist. Her nails dug into my skin. "I am leaving him, Riley. I have a flight booked for Paris tomorrow morning under my maiden name. But my personal accounts are monitored by Chase's accountants. If I transfer a large sum, they will flag it. I need your savings. Give me the $10,000 and you can use this folder to bury them." I looked at the terrified woman sitting across from me. The rot of greed did not just infect my father and brother. It infected the spouses. It infected the entire ecosystem of the Thorne elite. Lauren was perfectly content to spend fraudulent money and mock my poverty when the credit cards were working. Now that the house of cards was collapsing, she was willing to sell her husband out for the price of a first-class ticket to Europe. I slowly pulled my wrist from her grasp. "I am not giving you a dime, Lauren," I said, my voice cold and resolute. Her face contorted into a mask of pure panic. "Riley, please," she begged. "You hate them. They threw you out. This folder is your revenge." "I do not need your folder to get my revenge," I replied, sliding the documents back across the table. "And I do not finance cowards. You enjoyed the view from the top of the mountain. Now you can deal with the avalanche." Lauren stared at me, her chest heaving. The desperation in her eyes hardened into a bitter, resentful glare. "You are just as cold as your grandfather," she spat, snatching the folder and shoving it back into her purse. "You deserve to sleep in that rusted car." She stood up, turned on her heel, and marched back to her silver Porsche. I watched her speed out of the gravel lot, her tires kicking up a cloud of dust. I sat alone at the picnic table, the sound of the crashing waves filling the silence. The revelation completely recontextualized my family's actions over the past 48 hours. Their cruelty was not born of quiet superiority. It was born of desperate, manic projection. They were trying to crush me because they felt the walls closing in on themselves. Richard threatened my rescue center because he needed to feel powerful, while mainland lenders held his throat in a vice. Chase locked me out of the guest house because he was terrified of men in Chicago shattering his kneecaps. They were drowning, and the bank audit was the anvil tied to their ankles. I pulled out my phone and checked the date. The land use audit my father complained about in his boardroom was scheduled to conclude by the end of the week. The bank underwriters were digging into the resort deeds. They were searching for the collateral Richard promised them. But they were never going to find it, because the dirt beneath the resorts did not belong to Richard Thorne. It belonged to Pacific Apex LLC. The dramatic irony was agonizingly sweet. My father co-signed a $30 million debt with land he did not own. When the auditors realized the holding structure was a blind trust, the loan would default instantly. I smiled, sipping my iced coffee. The villains were standing on a trap door. They had built their entire kingdom over a massive, unseen void. I did not need to scream or fight or argue. I just needed to sit back and wait for the floor to open. But cornered men are unpredictable. When the bank finally delivered the fatal blow, how violently would Richard and Chase thrash against the inevitable drop? The knowledge of the $30 million deficit sat in my mind like a loaded weapon. Driving to the Marine Rescue Center the next morning, the coastal highway stretched out before me, bathed in bright, tropical sunlight. My beat-up Wrangler rattled over the uneven pavement, but my grip on the steering wheel was relaxed. Lauren had handed me the exact dimensions of the trap my father and brother were currently caught in. The private equity syndicate in Chicago was demanding their capital. The local lenders were demanding clean collateral to approve a bailout. And the Thorne men had nothing left but smoke and mirrors. I pulled into the gravel parking lot of the rescue facility. The familiar scent of iodine, salt water, and fish food drifted through the open windows. This was my sanctuary. We spent our days healing fractured shells and mending torn fins. We nurtured life. But as I shifted the vehicle into park, the illusion of safety shattered. A sleek, black, luxury sedan sat idling across two designated staff parking spots. The engine hummed a low, steady vibration. Leaning against the front grille of the expensive car was my older brother. I turned off the ignition and watched him through the windshield. Chase always prided himself on his immaculate appearance. He was the poster child for Ivy League venture capitalists. He wore custom suits and styled his hair with imported pomade. But the man standing in the dirt lot today looked like a hollowed-out shell. His designer linen shirt was wrinkled and stained with sweat around the collar. Dark purple bags hung beneath his bloodshot eyes. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, vibrating with a frantic, uncontainable energy. He looked hunted. I stepped out of my Jeep, locking the door behind me. I did not rush. I maintained a slow, measured pace as I walked toward the employee entrance. Chase pushed himself off the grill of his sedan and intercepted me, blocking the gravel path. "Riley," he breathed out. His voice was hoarse, carrying a desperate, ragged edge. "We need to handle something right now." He did not offer a greeting. He did not ask where I slept last night after he threw my belongings onto the lawn. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick stack of legal paper, bound by a heavy brass staple. He slammed the dense document down onto the warm hood of my Wrangler. The papers landed with a dull, heavy thud. I looked down at the top page. The bold black lettering across the header read, "Family Estate Release and Waiver of Claim." I kept my hands at my sides. "What is this, Chase?" I asked, keeping my tone entirely conversational. "It is just accountant red tape," he replied, waving his hand in a rapid, dismissive motion. "The probate lawyers are finalizing the operational transfers for the resorts. The bank requires every living heir to sign a standard liability waiver to clear the accounts. It is a meaningless formality. Just sign the back page so we can get the corporate ledgers updated." He reached into his other pocket and produced a thick stack of $100 bills secured with a paper currency band. He tossed the cash onto the hood next to the contract. $10,000, he said, pointing a trembling finger at the money. Dad authorized a final goodwill payout. Sign the release, take the cash, and you can go rent a nice apartment. You will not have to sleep in this rusted junk heap anymore. Everyone wins. I stared at the cash, and then at my brother. His lie was incredibly fragile. Lauren had already given me the translation. The local bank was refusing to clear the bailout loans until every potential claimant signed away their rights to the collateral. The underwriters needed a clean runway to process the deed transfer. If a single heir refused to sign, the loan would stall. And if the loan stalled, the ruthless syndicate in Chicago would come collecting their $30 million. Chase was not offering me $10,000 out of goodwill. He was trying to buy his own survival with pocket change. I picked up the heavy document. I flipped past the title page, scanning the dense paragraphs of legalese. It was an ironclad surrender. By signing the paper, I would legally forfeit any future claims to Thorne assets, trusts, or hidden holdings. It was a blind attempt to plug the leak in their sinking ship. "I am not signing this," I said, handing the document back to him. Chase refused to take it. He took a step closer, invading my personal space. The scent of stale alcohol and cold sweat rolled off him. "You do not have a choice, Riley," he hissed, his facade of corporate professionalism crumbling into raw panic. "Dad needs this filed by noon today. The accountants are waiting. Do not be difficult. Pick up the pen and sign the damn paper." He reached into his shirt pocket, produced a silver fountain pen, and shoved it toward my chest. I stepped back, creating distance between us. "I do not care what your accountants are waiting for," I replied. "I am not forfeiting my legal rights for $10,000. The rejection snapped the final thread of his restraint. His face contorted into a mask of pure, hostile rage. The veins in his neck bulged against his skin. "You ungrateful little fish feeder," he screamed, his voice echoing across the empty gravel lot. "You think you are so principled standing there in your cheap uniform. You are nothing. You are a footnote in this family. Dad and I are trying to protect a legacy while you play in the dirt with injured seagulls." His insults washed over me without leaving a single mark. A week ago, his words would have cut deep. They would have triggered tears and apologies. But standing in that parking lot, armed with the knowledge of Pacific Apex and his catastrophic deficit, his temper tantrum looked pathetic. He was a drowning man screaming at the ocean. "You are holding up millions in operational capital over a grudge," he shouted, spitting the words into the hot morning air. "Take the money. Sign the paper. Do not ruin this for us." I looked down at the 50 pages of legal surrender resting in my hand. I looked at the signature line on the final page where my name was printed beneath a blank space. Then I looked Chase dead in the eye. I gripped the thick binding of the contract with both hands. I twisted my wrists in opposite directions, applying firm pressure. The heavy paper resisted for a moment before tearing with a loud, crisp, ripping sound. I tore the entire document straight down the middle, splitting the signature page in half. "I do not sign things I have not read," I said, my voice dropping to a cold, unyielding whisper. I dropped the shredded halves of the contract onto the gravel at his feet. Chase stared at the ruined paper. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The realization of what I had just done hit him like a physical strike. Without that signature, the bank would freeze the audit. The bailout was dead. The Chicago syndicate was going to collect. He erupted. He let out a guttural roar of pure panic and kicked the side of my Wrangler. His leather dress shoe dented the metal door. "You just destroyed everything," he shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at my face. "You are dead, Riley. I will make sure you never work on this island again. I will bury you." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to match his hysteria. I simply turned around, walked to the driver's side of my Jeep, and unlocked the door. I climbed inside, starting the engine. "Take your $10,000 and buy a plane ticket, Chase," I said, rolling up the window. I shifted into reverse, tires crunching over the gravel, and backed out of the parking space. As I pulled onto the coastal highway, I checked my rearview mirror. My brother was kneeling in the dirt, frantically trying to piece the torn pages back together, his hands shaking uncontrollably. By refusing to sign that waiver, I had inadvertently lit the fuse on their financial bomb. The countdown to zero had begun. When the bank executives received the news that the heir refused to relinquish her claims, they would officially pull the plug on the collateral audit. The entire house of cards was about to collapse. As I drove toward the rescue center, a new question echoed in my mind. When the illusion of their wealth finally shattered, how far would my father go to drag me down into the wreckage with them? The 30-day probationary period crawled by with agonizing slowness. I spent 4 weeks existing in 2 completely separate realities. During daylight hours, I was a Marine rescue coordinator driving a dented vehicle and counting my spare change for lunch. But beneath the surface, I was a phantom billionaire, attending highly secure encrypted video conferences with Victoria Sterling. We watched the financial markets, we optimized the holding structures, and we fortified the invisible walls around Pacific Apex. Then, on a humid Tuesday morning, the clock finally ran out. The legal shields were cemented into place. The trust was impenetrable. Simultaneously, the Honolulu banking executives concluded their exhaustive land use audit. The convergence of these 2 events triggered an explosion that shook the foundations of the Thorne Empire. I was standing at the edge of the rehabilitation pool feeding herring to a recovering monk seal when my secured phone vibrated in my pocket. It was Victoria. "It is done," she said, her sharp voice carrying a rare note of grim satisfaction. "The mainland underwriters just delivered their final assessment to your father in the corporate penthouse. The hammer has officially dropped." I stepped away from the pool, wiping the fish scales from my hands. I asked her for the details. Victoria painted a vivid picture of the carnage unfolding miles away. Richard and Chase were hosting a critical meeting in the primary boardroom. They sat at the mahogany table, surrounded by senior executives, local banking officials, and two very intimidating representatives from the Chicago private equity syndicate. The tension in the room was suffocating. Richard had poured premium scotch, playing the role of the confident titan, anticipating the signature that would release his bailout capital. Instead, the lead underwriter slid a single manila folder across the polished wood. The bank executive informed Richard that the commercial bridge loans were denied. Furthermore, due to a catastrophic breach of collateral terms, the existing operational debt was now officially in default. Richard laughed, dismissing the statement as a clerical error. He demanded an explanation, insisting that the Thorne estate owned the most valuable coastal real estate in Hawaii. He told the bankers that the dirt beneath the resorts was worth 10 times the loan amount. The underwriter did not flinch. He opened the folder and presented the newly verified property records. He stated clearly that the Thorne estate did not own the land. The title registry confirmed that every square foot of acreage beneath the 7 resort properties was transferred 5 years ago. Richard stared at the documents, the color draining from his face. He demanded to know who held the deeds. The underwriter read the name off the official registry, Pacific Apex LLC. The revelation shattered the illusion of my father's wealth in a fraction of a second. The Chicago syndicate representatives stood up from their chairs. They informed Chase that since the collateral was fraudulent, the $30 million debt was now classified as a criminal default. They told my brother they would begin asset seizure by the end of the business day. Total panic consumed the boardroom. Chase began hyperventilating, gripping his chest as the reality of his ruin set in. Richard fired his lead accountant on the spot, screaming that someone had forged the documents. He ordered his corporate litigators to tear apart the Pacific Apex filing, to find the responsible party and destroy them. Victoria paused her recounting, allowing the magnitude of the fallout to settle over the phone line. "His lawyers scrambled," she continued. "They pulled the corporate formation documents for Pacific Apex. It took them less than an hour to hit the brick wall we built. They informed Richard that Pacific Apex is an irrevocable blind trust established directly by Harrison Thorne." My grip on the phone tightened. "They know it was Grandpa." "Yes," Victoria confirmed, "but they do not know the identity of the beneficiary. The blind trust structure is holding. Richard thinks Harrison left the land to a secret mistress, a hidden charity, or a rival developer. He has no idea his own daughter is the landlord." The irony was staggering. My father was currently launching a manhunt to destroy an entity he believed was a stranger, while the true owner was standing next to a seal pool wearing muddy rubber boots. "But Richard is not a man who accepts defeat gracefully," Victoria warned, her tone turning deadly serious. "He just made his final, desperate move." I asked her what he did. "He filed a massive civil lawsuit against the estate of Harrison Thorne," she explained. "It was recorded in the county courthouse 20 minutes ago. Richard is claiming that Harrison was mentally incompetent, senile, and suffering from severe dementia when he established the trust. He is arguing that the transfer of the deeds was a product of diminished capacity and therefore legally void." A cold knot formed in my stomach. The red herring Chase tried to feed me in the parking lot was now the official legal strategy. They were weaponizing my grandfather's final vulnerable days to steal back the empire. "Richard is demanding an emergency injunction to freeze the trust," Victoria said. He intends to drag Pacific Apex into probate court. He has unlimited corporate funds to pay his litigators. He wants to drown the blind beneficiary in a decade of legal filings until they run out of money and surrender the deeds. My father had pushed all his chips onto the table. He launched a legal nuke at his own father's legacy, aiming to obliterate Harrison's final wishes out of pure, unadulterated greed. He was willing to publicly drag a respected billionaire through the mud, portraying him as a crazy old man just to save his own sinking ship. The escalating conflict had reached its absolute peak. My physical safety was no longer the primary issue. The entire $400 million trust was under direct assault. I looked out over the Marine Center, watching my colleagues diligently working. If Richard succeeded in breaking the trust, the operations would consume the land. He would tear down the conservation efforts, sell the acreage to foreign developers, and evict the rescue center permanently. He would win. I asked Victoria if his lawsuit had a chance of succeeding. "Any lawsuit can succeed if the defense flinches," she replied sharply. "Richard thinks he is fighting an invisible entity with shallow pockets. He thinks the beneficiary will panic when the subpoenas arrive. He expects a surrender." I felt the chewed blue plastic pen resting in my pocket. I remembered Harrison's sharp, lucid eyes when he told me to watch how men act when they think no one is keeping score. Richard thought he could rewrite history because the author was dead. He was wrong. He is not getting a surrender. I told Victoria, my voice firm and unwavering. "Good," she replied. "I am calling an emergency meeting at my office. I have summoned Richard Chase and the probate judge. It is time to end this." I ended the call. The tropical sun beat down on my shoulders, but I felt a chilling calm settle into my bones. The trap my grandfather set 5 years ago was finally triggered. Richard thought his lawsuit was a brilliant offensive maneuver. He did not realize he just stepped directly onto a landmine. I walked toward my Jeep, tossing my rubber boots into the back. The audience would undoubtedly wonder if this massive lawsuit could successfully dismantle the trust I just inherited. Could a team of high-priced corporate litigators break the invisible walls around Pacific Apex? As I drove toward the financial district, the final confrontation loomed. The villains had played their last card. Now it was time to show them the full deck. The Honolulu skyline blurred past my window as I drove back to the financial district. The air inside the Jeep was stifling, but my mind was crystal clear. The transition from marine rescuer to phantom billionaire was complete. The 30 days of enduring my family's cruelty, sleeping in my vehicle, and swallowing their insults had forged an iron resolve within me. I parked in the same Bishop Street garage where this journey began, taking the private biometric elevator down into the subterranean vault of Pacific Crest Wealth Management. Victoria Sterling was waiting. Her charcoal pantsuit was impeccable, her posture radiating an apex predator confidence. Beside her sat a distinguished older man with a shock of white hair, wearing the somber black robes of his profession. Honorable Judge Thomas Kaluhi, the chief probate judge for the District of Honolulu. "They are upstairs," Victoria stated, adjusting a thick stack of manila folders on the titanium table. I moved the meeting to a secure conference room on the executive floor. Richard brought his lead litigator. "Chase looks like he hasn't slept in a week." I smoothed the front of my clean but simple button-down shirt. "Let us go," I said. We rode the elevator up to the top floor. The heavy mahogany doors of the conference room swung open, revealing a scene dripping with arrogant tension. Richard sat at the head of a massive glass table, pouring himself a glass of sparkling water. Chase slouched next to him, chewing on his fingernails, his designer suit looking disheveled and oversized. A sharp-featured man in a pinstripe suit, their lead litigator, sat with an open briefcase ready for war. As I walked into the room, taking a seat silently beside Victoria Richards' face contorted into a mask of pure, aggressive amusement. He let out a sharp, grating laugh. "What is this?" Richard scoffed, waving a dismissive hand in my direction. "Is this a joke, Victoria? I am here to discuss the illegal transfer of $400 million in commercial real estate by a senile old man. I do not have time for my vagrant daughter to beg for her job back. Get her out of here before I have security remove her." Judge Kaluhi cleared his throat, the sound instantly silencing the room. "You will maintain decorum in this meeting, Mr. Thorne," the judge warned, his voice carrying the heavy authority of the bench. "Miss Alexander has every right to be present." Richard tightened his jaw, pouring his water with an angry, aggressive motion. "Fine," he snapped. "Let us make this quick." My father was suffering from severe advanced dementia when he established this Pacific Apex holding company. He was paranoid out of his mind. My litigator has filed the formal incompetence lawsuit. We are requesting an immediate emergency injunction to freeze the trust and return the deeds to the primary estate. The litigator stood up, handing a bound copy of the lawsuit to Judge Kaluhi. "We have testimony from the estate secretary confirming Harrison exhibited erratic behavior. The transfer of those deeds was clearly a product of diminished capacity. The trust is legally void." Victoria Sterling did not stand. She did not raise her voice. She simply slid her hand onto the towering stack of manila folders resting in front of her. "You claim Harrison Thorne was incompetent," Victoria stated, her tone dropping to a deadly, clinical whisper. "You claim he was senile." She pushed the top folder across the glass table. It slid smoothly, stopping right in front of Richard. "That is an independent, board-certified psychiatric evaluation conducted by Dr. Eris Thorne, Chief of Neurology at Queen's Medical Center, Victoria, announced. It is dated 5 years ago, the exact week Pacific Apex was established. The conclusion states unequivocally that Harrison possessed full, brilliant cognitive capacity." Richard stared at the folder, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. "That is one doctor," he argued, recovering quickly. "I can find 3 who will say he was slipping." Victoria slid a second folder across the table. "That is an evaluation from Dr. Chen, leading specialist in geriatric cognitive function, dated 4 years ago. Full capacity." She slid a third folder, a fourth, a fifth. The heavy files piled up in front of Richard like bricks in a wall, sealing him inside a tomb. Harrison Thorne submitted to a rigorous, independent psychiatric examination every single month for the last 60 months of his life, Victoria declared, the volume of her voice rising steadily. 60 separate, notarized, irrefutable documents confirming that his mind was a steel trap until the very moment his heart stopped. The litigator's face went entirely pale. He slowly lowered himself back into his chair, looking at the mountain of evidence that just obliterated his entire case. "Your incompetence lawsuit is frivolous," Victoria stated, looking directly at Richard. "It is a desperate fiction designed to steal back assets you believe you are entitled to. The blind trust stands. Pacific Apex is impenetrable." Chase let out a strangled, panicked gasp. "Dad," he whispered, grabbing Richard's sleeve, "if the trust stands, we do not have the collateral. The Chicago syndicate is going to kill me." Richard yanked his arm away, his face flushing a dangerous shade of red. "It does not matter," he shouted, slamming his fist onto the glass. "I still control the operational side. I still have $40 million in liquid capital. I will drain the resort accounts to pay off the debt, and I will spend the next 10 years suing this phantom trust into the ground. I will bankrupt whoever the beneficiary is." He leaned across the table, glaring at Victoria. "I am Richard Thorne. You cannot destroy me." Victoria offered a smile that was absolutely terrifying in its precision. "I am not going to destroy you, Richard," she replied softly. "You already did that yourself." She opened the final leather binder, revealing a copy of Harrison's original primary will, the document that distributed the initial millions to my father and brother. Judge Kaluhi adjusted his reading glasses, leaning forward to inspect the document. Harrison knew you would try to break the trust, Victoria explained. He knew your greed would blind you to the consequences. So he embedded a very specific mechanism into the primary will. It is buried in the final addendum. She tapped a manicured finger against a dense paragraph of legal text. This is an in terrorem clause, she announced, a no-contest provision. It explicitly states that if any named heir files a formal legal challenge against the estate, attempting to alter the distributions or challenge the competency of the testator, their original inheritance is immediately and irrevocably revoked. The air in the conference room seemed to vanish. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy and suffocating. Because you formally filed that incompetence lawsuit this morning, Victoria continued, her voice echoing, like a judge handing down a sentence. You triggered the snare. The $40 million in liquid capital, the $20 million venture fund, the operational control of the entire resort empire. She paused, letting the devastation hang over the table. It is gone, Richard. All of it. The funds are currently being frozen and rerouted to international charities as stipulated by the clause. You sued the estate. You lost your inheritance. The poetic justice was absolute. It was a masterpiece of moral architecture. I did not attack them. I did not sabotage their accounts or hack their ledgers. Their own unadulterated greed, the very entitlement that drove them to throw me out onto the street, had triggered the legal trap. They brought brute force to a meticulous chess match and completely slaughtered themselves. Richard gasped for air, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from the water. His eyes darted around the room, searching for an exit, a loophole, a technicality. There was nothing. He was a ruined man. Chase let out a high-pitched, wailing sob. He collapsed forward, resting his head on the glass table, weeping uncontrollably. The syndicate was coming for him, and his father no longer had the funds to bail him out. The fake venture capitalist was finished. The litigator quietly snapped his briefcase shut and walked out of the room, abandoning his clients. Richard slowly turned his head, looking at Victoria. His eyes were bloodshot, hollowed out by the sudden realization of his total defeat. Who, he croaked his voice, a pathetic, shattered whisper. Who is the beneficiary of Pacific Apex? Who owns the land? Victoria did not answer him. She slowly turned her head and looked directly at me. Judge Kaluhi also turned his gaze toward me, offering a small, respectful nod. Richard followed their eyes. He stared at me, at his vagrant daughter, wearing a simple button-down shirt, sitting quietly at the edge of the table. The comprehension hit him with the force of a physical blow. The worthless girl he evicted, the fish feeder he tried to blackmail, the failure he mocked. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the chewed blue plastic pen. I set it gently on the glass table, letting the cheap plastic clatter against the expensive surface. I own the dirt, Richard, I said, keeping my voice low and steady. My father stared at the pen and then at my face. The sheer weight of the dramatic irony crushed whatever fight he had left. The villain realized he was standing in a kingdom owned entirely by the scapegoat. The trap had snapped shut, breaking their empire into dust. But as the reality of their bankruptcy settled into the room, a new desperate question arose. With their wealth gone and their debts calling, how would these entitled men survive the immediate, violent fallout of their own collapse? The silence in the executive conference room stretched until it felt like the glass walls might shatter from the pressure. Richard stared at the blue plastic pen resting on the table. The reality of his catastrophic defeat was sinking into his bones, slowly calcifying the realization that he was no longer a titan of industry. He was just a man with a mountain of debt and a frozen bank account. Chase was the first to break. The weeping that had racked my brother's shoulders suddenly twisted into something far more dangerous. He lifted his head, his face slick with tears and snot, his eyes wide and manic. He looked at me, taking in the calm, steady posture of the sister he had tormented his entire life. Then his gaze shifted to his father. the man who was supposed to guarantee his survival, the man who had just pushed the button that detonated their inheritance. "You sued them," Chase whispered, his voice shaking with a feral, unhinged energy. "You filed the incompetence lawsuit. You triggered the clause." Richard did not look at his son. He kept his eyes glued to the table, his jaw clenched tight. "I was trying to save the collateral," Richard muttered, sounding weak and defensive. "I did not know the old man laid a trap. I was trying to protect our assets." "Protect our assets," Chase shrieked, the volume of his voice spiking so sharply it made the judge flinch. "You lost everything, you arrogant, stupid old man. You could not just take the operations and leave the trust alone. You had to own it all. You had to fight the ghost. And now, I am going to die. The syndicate is going to kill me, Richard." Chase scrambled out of his ergonomic chair. He did not move toward the exit. He lunged across the glass table. With a guttural roar, Chase threw his body weight at his father, grabbing the lapels of Richard's custom-tailored suit. The momentum sent them both crashing backward. Richard's chair tipped over, and the two men slammed onto the plush corporate carpet. It was a pathetic, chaotic display. The polished veneer of the Thorn elite completely evaporated, revealing the terrified, savage animals beneath. Chase swung his fists wildly, striking his father's shoulders and chest, screaming that Richard had ruined his life. Richard grunted, trying to shield his face, shoving his son backward and shouting for him to get a grip. Victoria Sterling reached over and pressed a discreet silver button under the conference table. Within seconds, the heavy mahogany doors burst open. 3 massive security guards stormed into the room. They did not hesitate. They grabbed Chase by the arms, dragging him off his father. Chase kicked and thrashed against their grip, his designer shoes scuffing the floor, screaming obscenities at Richard as they hauled him out into the hallway. Richard remained on the floor, his tie ripped and his hair wild. He stared up at the acoustic ceiling tiles, chest heaving a portrait of absolute humiliation. I sat quietly, watching the men who had locked me out in the cold tear each other apart for scraps. There was no triumph in my heart. There was no glee. Only a profound, solemn peace. My grandfather had orchestrated this moment perfectly. He knew that placing immense pressure on a fractured foundation would cause the structure to collapse inward. The thieves were turning on each other, unable to survive without the unearned wealth that bound them together. I stood up, retrieved the blue plastic pen, and walked out of the room, leaving my father on the floor. The implosion of the Alexander men did not stop in the law office. The fallout radiated outward, tearing through the social and corporate fabric of Honolulu with staggering speed. I spent the next week managing the transition of Pacific Apex, with Victoria watching the destruction of my family unfold from the safe distance of my new reality. Lauren made good on her promise. The moment the news of the defaulted loans leaked into the financial district, she executed her escape plan. But she did not leave quietly. She filed for an emergency at-fault divorce, citing severe financial abuse and emotional distress. She hired a process server to ambush Chase in the lobby of the flagship Thorn Resort, right in front of the concierge desk and a dozen wealthy tourists. The public humiliation was complete when Lauren posted a highly edited, tearful video to her massive social media following. She sat in front of a ring light, dabbing her dry eyes with the tissue, playing the ultimate victim. She claimed she was fleeing the island to escape the toxic criminal behavior of the Thorn men, begging her followers for prayers and support, while simultaneously launching a GoFundMe to cover her legal fees. She was a master of the grift, abandoning the sinking ship with stolen lifeboats. Chase was left entirely alone. Without Lauren to manage his public image and without Richard to fund his defense, his world rapidly shrank. I read the police blotter the following morning. 2 luxury sports cars, a vintage Ferrari and a custom Range Rover, were aggressively repossessed from his driveway in the middle of the night. The bank seized his accounts. He was locked out of his own venture capital firm, his partners scrambling to distance themselves from the looming fraud charges. Chase had become a ghost in his own life. Richard fared no better. The board of directors for the Thorn Resort operations convened an emergency vote. The optics of their operational president losing his inheritance due to a frivolous lawsuit against his own father were catastrophic for the luxury brand. The board voted unanimously to oust Richard, severing his executive salary and revoking his corporate privileges. He was escorted from his penthouse office by the same security guards who had dragged his son away a few days prior. The family that had bonded over mocking my modest life was now dismantled. The unearned privilege was stripped away, leaving them exposed to the harsh elements of reality. Money had indeed removed their masks, and beneath the facade, there was nothing but cowardice and greed. I moved into Harrison's pristine oceanfront estate. The property was held within the Pacific Apex Trust, untouched by the bankruptcy and the probate freeze. I walked through the quiet, empty halls, tracing my fingers over the antique furniture and the vast library of leather-bound books. The silence of the house was a comfort. I had won the war without throwing a single punch. I spent my days working with Victoria, restructuring the leases for the resorts, ensuring the operational board understood the Pacific Apex was now their landlord, and that I expected rigorous environmental compliance moving forward. The Marine Rescue Center was thriving, the new surgical wing already under construction. My life was settling into a powerful, purposeful rhythm. But a lingering shadow hung over the estate. The destruction of my family was comprehensive, but my father was a man who survived by manipulating the emotions of those around him. He had lost his money, his power, and his status, but he still knew how to play the role of the wounded patriarch. He knew I was the owner of the dirt. He knew I held the keys to the kingdom. As the sun set over the Pacific, casting long golden rays across the manicured lawns of the estate, the security intercom mounted on the wall of the kitchen buzzed loudly. The sharp electronic sound shattered the peaceful evening quiet. I walked over and pressed the camera button. The grainy black and white monitor flickered to life. Standing outside the heavy wrought iron gates of the property was Richard Thorn. He looked terrible. His clothes were rumpled, he was unshaven, and his shoulders slumped with the heavy weight of defeat. He was leaning against the intercom speaker, looking directly into the camera lens. The final loose end had arrived. The ultimate confrontation was at my doorstep. Richard was a desperate man backed into a corner, and cornered predators use whatever weapons they have left. Would he resort to threats, anger, or the most dangerous tactic of all, a plea for family loyalty? I stared at the monitor, preparing myself for the final test of my boundaries. How do you handle an abuser when they finally fall to their knees? The grainy black and white security monitor cast a pale glow across the dark kitchen. I stood motionless, watching the man on the screen. Richard Thorn, the former undisputed king of the island hospitality industry, leaned heavily against the stone pillar of the front gate. His bespoke linen suit was rumpled and stained. His tie hung loose around his neck. The proud, arrogant posture that defined his entire existence had evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, desperate shell. He pressed the buzzer again. The sharp electronic tone echoed through the empty hallways of my grandfather's oceanfront estate. I did not press the intercom button to speak. I simply turned away from the screen and picked up a thin manila folder resting on the marble island. Victoria Sterling had couriered the document to me earlier that afternoon. While the resort board of directors had stripped my father of his executive title and salary, he was currently squatting in the luxury corporate penthouse. He refused to leave, claiming executive privilege. But the penthouse belonged to the building, and the building sat on land owned by Pacific Apex. As the ultimate landlord, the final decision rested in my hands. I walked through the quiet house, stepping out the front door into the warm, tropical night. The air was thick with humidity and the sweet fragrance of night-blooming jasmine. Crickets chirped a steady rhythm hidden within the manicured foliage. The gravel driveway crunched beneath my shoes as I made the long walk toward the perimeter. The estate was secured by towering wrought iron gates stretching 10 feet high and topped with sharp, formidable spikes. As I approached the barrier, Richard lifted his head. His eyes locked onto my silhouette emerging from the shadows. "Riley," he called out, his voice cracking. It was a raspy, broken sound, entirely devoid of his usual booming authority. I stopped a few feet away from the iron bars, keeping a safe distance. I did not say a word. I simply watched him. He took a staggering step forward, pressing his hands against the cold metal. "Riley, please," he begged. "You have to listen to me." When I maintained my silence, Richard deployed his ultimate weapon. He let his knees buckle. The former Titan collapsed into the dirt outside the gate, kneeling in the dust. He bowed his head and his shoulders began to shake. A loud, sobbing sound escaped his lips. "I am so sorry," he cried, gripping the iron bars like a prisoner begging for a pardon. "I failed you. I was blinded by the stress of the business and the pressure to maintain your grandfather's legacy. I lost my way. Please forgive me." It was a masterful performance. If I were the same naive girl who used to crave his approval, the sight of my father weeping in the dirt might have broken my heart. I might have rushed to open the gate, offering comfort and a warm bed. He was counting on that exact reaction. He was relying on the deeply ingrained caretaker instincts I spent years developing while tending to Harrison. "You are the only family I have left." Richard wept, looking up at me with wet, shining eyes. "Chase is terrified. The men from Chicago are threatening him. They told him if he does not produce $3 million by tomorrow evening, they are going to ensure he faces federal wire fraud charges. He will go to a maximum security prison, Riley. He will not survive a place like that." He paused, letting the heavy, emotional weight of his words settle into the night air. "We need a lifeline," he whispered, pressing his face against the iron. "Just a small loan. $3 million is nothing to the trust. It is a fraction of a percent. You can save your brother. You can save your family. We can start over. I will do whatever you ask. I will work for you. Just please open the gate." I stared down at the man kneeling in the gravel. I looked past the tears and the trembling voice, searching for a shred of genuine remorse. There was none. His eyes were darting, rapidly analyzing my posture, calculating the effectiveness of his routine. He was not mourning the destruction of our family. He was mourning his empty bank accounts. He was trying to manipulate a girl he believed was inherently soft and pliable. I reached into the pocket of my trousers and retrieved the chewed blue plastic pen, the very item Harrison had given me on his deathbed. I opened the manila folder I carried from the kitchen. I rested it against the flat iron surface of the gate mechanism. Inside was the formal eviction notice, demanding Richard Thorne vacate the corporate penthouse immediately. It detailed the termination of his residential privileges and explicitly banned him from entering any properties situated on Pacific Apex land. "What are you doing?" Richard asked, his sobbing abruptly halting. The calculated sorrow vanished instantly, replaced by a flicker of genuine confusion. I clicked the pen open. I signed my name on the bottom line of the legal document. My signature was steady, precise, and final. I closed the folder and slid it through a narrow gap between the iron bars, letting it drop onto the dirt just inches from his knees. Richard stared at the folder and then looked back up at me. "You are not crying because you hurt me, Dad," I said, keeping my voice chillingly calm. The words hung in the air, slicing through the humid night. Richard froze. His hands slowly released their grip on the iron bars. "You are crying because you got caught," I continued. "You are weeping because the mainland lenders found your empty collateral. You are devastated because the board threw you out. You spent my entire life telling me I was a failure because I cared about living things instead of profit margins. When you thought you held the power, you did not hesitate to destroy my career and throw my belongings onto the front lawn. You wanted to watch me suffer." "Riley, that was a mistake," he stammered, scrambling to pick up the folder. I did not let him finish. I reached into my other pocket and pulled out a crisp, standard $20 bill. I held it between my fingers, letting the ambient light from the security lamp illuminate the green paper. I thought about the night I slept in my Jeep. I thought about the sheer terror of homelessness he inflicted upon me without a second thought. I thought about the cruel laughter in the law office when they handed me what they believed was bus fare. I flicked my wrist, tossing the $20 bill through the iron bars. The paper fluttered in the ocean breeze, landing gently on top of the eviction notice at his feet. "You evicted me," I said, staring directly into his hollow eyes. "I am just respecting your boundaries." Richard's mouth dropped open. He looked at the $20 bill resting in the dirt. The ultimate rejection. The exact amount of unfeeling cruelty he had shown me returned to him with surgical precision. He had nothing left to say. His manipulation had struck an impenetrable wall. I did not wait for him to formulate another lie. I turned my back on my father. I walked up the long gravel driveway, heading toward the warm, glowing lights of my grandfather's estate. Behind me, I heard the distinct, heavy mechanical clank of the security system engaging, locking the towering iron gates permanently into place. The boundary was set. It was carved in stone and reinforced by steel. I refused to fund his toxicity. I refused to be the safety net for men who built their lives by cutting the ropes of others. As I reached the heavy oak doors of the house, a profound quiet settled over my soul. The storm had finally broken, leaving behind a clear, untroubled horizon. The past was locked outside the gates. Tomorrow, the sun would rise over the Pacific Ocean, and I would begin the real work of rebuilding the Thorne legacy. But even with the villains defeated and the empire secured, one final realization waited for me inside the quiet walls of the study. A realization that would bring my grandfather's elaborate puzzle to its ultimate, satisfying conclusion. 12 months evaporated like morning mist burning off the jagged peaks of the Ko'olau Mountains. A single year holds the power to change the entire geography of a life when you control the tectonic plates beneath the surface. I did not sell the coastal properties. Real estate conglomerates from Tokyo to New York submitted acquisition offers that would make a regular person dizzy. But Harrison Thorne did not leave me the dirt so I could pave it over for a quick profit. He left it to me so I could heal it. Working closely with Victoria Sterling, I enforced strict, uncompromising environmental covenants across all 7 operational leases. The corporate board of directors initially balked at the new mandates, citing increased overhead and reduced profit margins. I reminded them, through my legal proxy, that their leases were contingent upon my satisfaction. The complaints ceased immediately. The pristine beaches adjoining the Thorne resorts were declared protected conservation zones. We replaced the toxic landscaping pesticides with sustainable native agriculture and mandated zero-waste protocols for every kitchen in the hospitality network. The luxury brand shifted its entire ethos from rampant consumption to ecological stewardship. The guests loved the new direction, and revenue actually increased, proving my father wrong on every conceivable metric. The true triumph, however, resided on the North Shore. The Marine Rescue Facility transformed from a struggling concrete building patching together donations into a premier research and rehabilitation institute. We unveiled the new state-of-the-art surgical wing in late spring. Dr. Evans stood at the wooden podium during the ribbon-cutting ceremony, crying tears of genuine joy. We celebrated by releasing 3 rehabilitated monk seals back into the wild, watching them slide across the wet sand and disappear into the turquoise surf. Despite the shift in my financial reality, I still wore my rubber boots and faded polo shirts 2 days a week. I still scrubbed the algae tanks, measured out the vitamin supplements, and chopped frozen herring. The billionaire landowner identity remained a quiet shadow, operating in the background, ensuring the water stayed clean and the staff remained well paid. The physical labor kept my hands calloused and my heart tethered to the reason I stayed on the island in the first place. My family experienced a profoundly different transition. The karma they earned collected its dues with relentless, unforgiving precision. Chase managed to avoid federal prison, but the cost of his freedom was total ruin. He liquidated every remaining asset he possessed, turning over his offshore accounts, his stock options, and his remaining property to satisfy a brutal restitution agreement with the Chicago private equity syndicate. His days as an Ivy League venture capitalist are a distant, faded memory. He currently works in a strip mall electronics store in a dusty, sun-baked suburb of Las Vegas. Private investigators confirmed his new reality for Victoria. Chase wears a stiff polyester polo shirt with a plastic name tag pinned to his chest. He spends his days organizing rows of discounted charging cables and explaining warranty policies to irritated tourists. A court order garnishes 80% of his minimum wage paycheck before he even sees the direct deposit, sending the funds straight to his remaining creditors. There are no more tailored suits. There are no more platinum watches. He spends 8 hours a day standing on a hard linoleum floor, forced to smile and apologize to entitled customers who treat him exactly the way he used to treat me. He is trapped in a cage of his own making, stripped of his unearned armor and drowning in the repetitive, agonizing reality of the working class he once mocked. Richard faces a quieter, more isolating devastation. The board of directors successfully blocked his desperate attempts to access any residual corporate funds, finalizing his severance with extreme prejudice. My father lives in a cramped one-bedroom apartment in a humid, decaying concrete complex miles away from the ocean breeze. The sweeping panoramic views of Waikiki Beach are gone, replaced by a single dirt-streaked window staring at a brick alleyway. His phone never rings. The local politicians he used to golf with do not return his messages. The high society elite who drank his premium scotch deleted his contact information the moment the bankruptcy became public record. Island society is notoriously tight-knit, and nobody wants to associate with a deposed king who sued his own father and lost. Richard sits alone in a cheap, worn armchair, nursing budget liquor, staring at peeling paint on the walls. He has no legacy left to protect. He has no empire to rule. He spends his evenings listening to the muted sounds of traffic outside, realizing that the silence in his apartment is permanent. He cut the ropes of everyone who cared about him, and now he is in a free fall with no safety net in sight. I sit in my grandfather's study on the top floor of his oceanfront estate. The sliding glass doors are wide open, allowing the warm evening trade winds to sweep through the room, lifting the sheer curtains. The scent of salt water mixes with the rich, comforting aroma of aged leather and polished cedar. The heavy mahogany desk is clear of clutter, save for the chewed blue plastic pen resting near a vintage brass inkwell. Mounted on the wall, directly eye level with the leather chair, is a custom glass shadow box frame. Inside the frame rest 2 vintage silver certificates. The microscopic red ink still circles the specific routing numbers, marking the exact coordinates of my salvation. There are only 2 bills in the frame, because the third one remains in the dirt outside the iron gates, a permanent marker of the boundary I drew in the dark. I lean back in the chair and look out toward the horizon where the sun is sinking into the Pacific, painting the clouds in vibrant shades of gold and violet. People think wealth is about what you can buy. They think it is about the luxury cars, the penthouse suites, the designer labels, and the ability to walk into a crowded room and demand attention. They spend their entire lives chasing a higher number in a ledger, believing it will buy them respect. But my grandfather taught me a very different lesson during his final days on this earth. He taught me that real wealth is the ability to say no to the people who think they own you. It is the freedom to walk away from toxic tables where love is treated like a transactional currency. It is the power to draw a line in the sand and protect the things that truly matter without ever having to raise your voice. If you are listening to this right now and you have ever been the scapegoat of your family, I want you to remember something very important. The people who overlook your worth and underestimate your quiet strength are usually the ones writing the opening chapters of their own downfall. You do not need to scream to prove them wrong. You do not need to twist yourself into knots trying to earn the affection of individuals who are committed to misunderstanding you. You just need to endure the storm, trust your own moral compass, and hold on to your principles. The truth always finds a way to the surface, and the universe has a remarkable talent for balancing the scales. Would you have forgiven them if they crawled to your front gate crying in the dirt? Would you have handed them a financial lifeline, or would you have let them face the harsh, unyielding consequences of their own choices? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and hit that subscribe button for more stories where karma always collects its debts. When we look back at the wreckage and the triumph of the Thorne family, the true narrative is not really about a $400 million real estate trust, nor is it about the brilliant execution of a hidden legal loophole. Beneath the dramatic reveals and the shattered egos, the story of Riley, Richard, Chase, and Harrison is fundamentally a profound meditation on the legacy of parenting. It holds a mirror up to the core values of the traditional American family structure, forcing us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question. What are we actually handing down to our children when we pass the torch to the next generation? In modern American culture, there is a pervasive and dangerous temptation to equate the role of a successful parent with the accumulation of financial wealth. We are conditioned to believe that if we provide a sprawling house, fully funded college tuitions, and trust funds, we have fulfilled our ultimate duty. Richard Thorne fell completely into this hollow trap. He believed his title, his tailored suits, and his bank accounts excused him from the heavier, far more demanding work of actual fatherhood. He provided his son Chase with infinite financial safety nets, bailing him out of every failed venture and every reckless decision. But in shielding his son from the natural consequences of his actions, Richard robbed Chase of the opportunity to develop character. He raised a boy who knew the price of a platinum watch, but possessed absolutely zero emotional awareness. Chase became a monster of entitlement because his father taught him that money was a substitute for morality. When a parent removes honesty and fairness from the family dynamic, replacing them with favoritism and unearned privilege, they do not build a legacy. They build a house of cards, waiting for a strong enough wind to knock it all down. On the opposite side of that toxic coin stood Riley. In many traditional family dynamics, there is an unspoken, deeply unfair expectation placed upon the daughters to become the emotional shock absorbers. Riley was expected to sacrifice her youth, her time, and her energy to provide the grueling, unglamorous end-of-life care for her grandfather, while the men in the family were praised simply for existing in corporate boardrooms. Her father and brother confused her compassion with weakness. They lacked the emotional intelligence to understand that true strength is not loud or boastful. True strength is sitting in a quiet room, crushing medication into applesauce, and holding the hand of a dying man without ever asking what you will get in return. This is where the profound long-term guidance of Harrison Thorne changes the entire narrative. Harrison realized, too late, that he could not fix the profound moral failures of his own son. He watched Richard become corrupted by greed, and he watched that same greed poison his grandson. But Harrison recognized that he had one final opportunity to parent. He understood that true long-term guidance does not mean handing your descendants the keys to a kingdom they lack the character to rule. It means setting a boundary. Harrison's $60 test was a masterclass in evaluating the honesty, patience, and emotional depth of his family. He weaponized their own arrogance against them. He knew that Richard and Chase lacked the basic humility to look closely at something small and seemingly insignificant. By hiding the keys to a $400 million empire on the face of three $20 bills, Harrison delivered the ultimate parental lesson. He taught them that arrogance blinds you to the truth, and that unearned entitlement will always, eventually, be your undoing. Parenting is not just about protecting your children from the world. Sometimes it is about protecting the world from your children. Harrison did just that. He placed the immense power of the Pacific Apex Trust into the hands of the only person who possessed the moral compass required to wield it. Riley did not use the wealth to destroy her family. She simply stepped out of the way and allowed the natural consequences of their own deceit, their own fraudulent loans, and their own ruthless lawsuits to swallow them whole. This story resonates so deeply because it taps into a universal craving for cosmic fairness. We all want to believe that emotional awareness, quiet dedication, and fundamental honesty will eventually outweigh loud, aggressive greed. We want to believe that the people who mistreat others will eventually have to sit alone in the quiet dark, facing the exact measure of pain they casually inflicted on the innocent. If you find yourself drawn to these moments of profound justice, if you believe that the universe eventually balances the scales and that karma is just a natural consequence of our own character, then make sure to follow the channel Revenge Order. We explore the deepest corners of human nature, bringing you stories where the truth always rises to the surface and the underdogs finally inherit the earth. As the dust settles on the Thorne estate, we are left to ponder our own reflections. The gates are locked, the blue plastic pen rests on the mahogany desk, and the ocean continues its steady, rhythmic crash against the shore. We spend so much time worrying about the inheritances we will leave behind in our wills. We worry about the property deeds, the stock portfolios, and the family silver. But the truth is, your children are not inheriting your money. They are inheriting your character. They are inheriting the way you speak to the waiter, the way you handle failure, and the way you treat the people who can do absolutely nothing for you. Look closely at the people sitting around your own dinner table. Look at the children absorbing your every word and your every silence. Are you building a legacy of emotional awareness, honesty, and quiet strength? Or are you building a brittle empire of ego, waiting for a $60 test to expose the cracks in the foundation? The answer might just determine who ends up holding the keys and who is left standing outside the gate, knocking on a door that will never open again.